Hello, my dear friends. In the deepest parts of a medieval winter, for the women living in those stone castles, filth wasn't just something they lived with. They slept in it, they wore it, and in a way, they passed it down like a strange tradition. There were no hot baths, no clean linens, and really no shame about it. Can you imagine if your face powder was made from ashes scraped from the fireplace? Or if your shampoo was just melted goose fat? Every little act of what they called hygiene wasn't about cleansing. It was more about camouflaging decay. Behind every beautiful silk curtain, there was a smell you probably can't even imagine. And behind every noble title was a body, just as unwashed as any servant's. Tonight, you're going to step inside that cold, breathless world and really feel what it meant to be clean back in the Middle Ages. So before you get too comfortable, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. But please, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from all around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background noise, and let's start this journey together tonight. If you were to walk through the cold corridors of a medieval castle in the middle of winter, the air would feel heavy, thick with the smell of smoke and damp stone. Inside, women would be wrapped in layers and layers of wool and fur, but underneath all those fabrics, their skin was coated with something else entirely. They covered their bodies in animal fat, a glossy, greasy shield made from the melted remains of geese or maybe pigs. With no warm water and no real soap, this fat became their substitute for a bath. It was meant to seal the skin from the biting chill, trap their body heat, and give a faint illusion of comfort. But it also trapped everything else: the sweat, the dust, and the simple odor of living too close to your own body. It's almost darkly amusing when you think about it, that what they called protection from the cold was also a recipe for smelling like a kitchen that hadn't been washed in weeks. The preparation itself was a little ritual. Pots of fat were kept near the fire, just soft enough to spread, but not hot enough to burn your skin. A woman might take a handful, rub it between her palms, and then smooth it all over her arms, her chest, and her legs until her skin gleamed. Some would even add a little ash to dull that shine. Others crushed dried herbs or flower petals into the fat, believing it made the smell a bit more pleasant. The scent of rosemary or lavender might linger for a little while, but before long, it just mixed with sweat and smoke until you really couldn't tell the difference anymore. On the skin, the fat would harden just slightly, creating this thin film that felt both protective and kind of suffocating at the same time. It was warmth, but it was warmth bought at the cost of being clean. Bathing in those months was just unthinkable. The stone walls held in the cold like an endless winter's breath, and any water, if you fetched it from a well or a river, would probably freeze before you could even pour it. Even the wealthiest women avoided baths because they were terrified that washing would open their pores and invite sickness in. So they layered the fat, day after day, turning their skin into something that was halfway between flesh and wax. When they undressed at night, the fabric of their underclothes would stick to their bodies, the cloth itself stiff with all that grease. The smell clung to their rooms, to their bedsheets, to the very air they were breathing. If we were to try and compare this to today, it'd be like replacing every shower with a coat of melted bacon grease and just pretending that counted as hygiene. In those castles, the fireplaces burned almost constantly. The smoke would curl through all the cracks and fill the chambers, settling right into the animal fat that covered their bodies. The result was a scent that no amount of herbs could ever hide, a mixture of smoke and salt and decay that just became the signature smell of winter living. And yet for them, it was normal. Cleanliness was all relative. No one expected to smell like flowers when the world outside reeked of mud and livestock. To be warm was to be alive, and just being alive was enough. There was also this belief, whispered among servants and noble women alike, that animal fat held some kind of healing powers. Goose fat was said to soften the skin, and pig fat to strengthen it. Mothers would rub it on their children's faces before sending them off to bed, thinking it would keep away frostbite. The line between care and superstition blurred so easily in the cold. When frost appeared on the windows, it looked almost like their skin itself, pale, hardened, and fragile. A woman might touch the glass and feel a sort of kinship with its smooth, frozen surface. But the longer the winter lasted, the heavier that layer of grease became. Dust clung to it. Fleas would hide in it. And when they scratched, the skin underneath would burn, irritated by this mixture of dirt and old fat. Some tried scraping it off with blunt knives or rough claws, though this really only left red marks and more pain. The servants had the worst of it, of course, reusing the same handful of fat for weeks, kept in these small pots that turned rancid over time. When they spread it on their skin, it released this sour smell that mingled with the smoke from the hearth, forming the true scent of a medieval winter. Still, this ritual of smearing on fat was never questioned. In a world without any alternatives, habit just becomes truth. The fat was warmth, the warmth was survival, and survival excused everything. The women believed that keeping clean was far less important than keeping alive. And maybe, in a way, they were right. There's something disturbingly relatable in the way people can convince themselves that filth is perfectly normal, as long as everyone around them is doing the same thing. By spring, the skin underneath would be rough and yellowed, like old parchment, and washing away months of grease took days, sometimes even weeks. The first bath of the year was as much a shedding as it was a cleansing. Servants would boil water in these great cauldrons and carry it to the baths, their arms slick with sweat despite the cool air. The women would sit in the tub, just watching this cloudy film rise to the surface like a ghost of winters past. Beneath it, their skin felt both new and tender, as if it were being reborn from under all the layers of the season's filth. To imagine a scene like that now feels almost unreal. Yet within those stone walls, this was just daily life. Slow, uncomfortable, and defined completely by necessity. The animal fat did more than just protect them from the cold. It blurred the line between survival and decay. The walls of the castle held the warmth, but they also held the memory of everything that had been trapped within them. The air smelled of life, preserved through grime. And outside, where the frost still clung to the windows, another form of struggle was waiting. How to clean their hair when even water itself would turn to ice. The castle's walls held the kind of cold that seemed to seep into absolutely everything, from the stone floors to the very breath of the people inside. Water would freeze in its pails before the morning was even done. And yet, there were still some women who tried to wash their hair, clinging to some fragile sense of dignity in the middle of the long winter. There was no warm bath, no gentle steam rising up to soften the chill. The water they drew from the well was like melted glass, biting into the skin and numbing any fingers that dared to touch it. When it was poured over the scalp, it shocked the body so deeply that you'd stop breathing for just a moment. The strands of hair would darken, cling together, and then just stiffen, freezing solid before they could ever dry. What should have been a cleansing act became a punishment. It's almost absurd that a ritual meant to feel pure could make someone look like a statue carved from ice. After that first pour, the water would quickly turn to frost as soon as it hit the air. The room itself was like a stone tomb, its walls exhaling cold rather than any warmth. Women would wrap towels around their heads, pressing their palms against the linen, just to steal what little heat remained from their own bodies. But even the fabric stiffened, becoming more like ice than cloth. Some would sit by the hearth for hours, their hands trembling as they reached closer and closer to the fire, being so careful not to burn their hair. The smell of smoke mixed with damp wool filled the air. Sparks popped softly, while drops of melted ice hissed as they fell into the flames. In that small circle of warmth, they just waited, shivering, as strands of hair thawed out one by one. Many just gave up on it entirely. The memory of the last washing stayed sharp in their minds. The frozen scalp, the headache that lasted all night long, the fear of catching a chill that would settle into your lungs and never leave. Weeks would pass, then months, and the whole idea of washing became a distant thought, something to be saved for kinder seasons. Hair grew heavy with oil, weighed down by days of smoke and sweat. The texture changed from silk to a coarse rope, each strand slick and sticky from being constantly handled. Beneath the layers of cloth they wore, the smell was unmistakable, yet nobody ever spoke of it. Everyone smelled the same, and in that sameness there was a strange kind of comfort. If we were to compare it to today, it would be like spending an entire winter without washing your hair, and then convincing yourself that the sheen was a style, not just grease. Even those who had servants couldn't escape the cold's cruelty. The noble women would sit by the hearth while their attendants heated combs made of bone or iron, pressing them gently through the stiff strands. Sometimes a spark would catch, and the faint scent of burnt hair would drift upwards. They bore it without flinching. Better a little scorch than frostbite, they probably thought. Some rubbed goose fat into their scalps, believing it protected them against the cold and kept their hair soft. The result was far from elegant. The fat trapped dirt and lice, making the hair glisten in a really unnatural way in the dim candlelight. Still, they accepted it, mistaking endurance for some kind of grace. There is something quietly tragic in how people learn to see discomfort as beauty when survival demands it. The castle's air carried no mercy. Smoke from the hearth mixed with a damp scent of stone, and every single breath felt old. Women slept with their heads wrapped in scarves to keep in the warmth, though the fabric just absorbed all the sweat and oil, creating a film that clung to their skin. When they finally unwrapped the layers, the air that met their hair was cold enough to sting. Servants would brush it with stiff bristles, pulling through tangles that were hardened by grease and dust. Strands of hair broke, fell like thin threads of darkness onto the floor, and were swept into piles that smelled faintly of ash. The act of grooming became a small kind of suffering, repeated each and every morning. Illness was never far away. The sudden cold from wet hair could mean a fever by nightfall, and fevers in winter often ended in death. Mothers warned their daughters not to wash too often, telling them that warmth mattered so much more than cleanliness. And so they learned early on that beauty and health rarely coexisted. The castle might have looked grand from the outside, but within its walls, the inhabitants moved slowly, conserving heat, preserving life in these small, uncomfortable ways. The idea of comfort itself was foreign. Cleanliness was a luxury, reserved only for the brave or maybe the foolish. By spring, the transformation was almost a ritual. When the frost finally melted and water ran freely again, they would wash their hair in earnest. Basins were filled, steam rose, and for a few moments the castle smelled of soap and herbs instead of smoke and sweat. But that relief only came once or twice a year. The rest of the time, their hair was a map of survival, marked by grease, soot, and endurance. It told the story of cold nights and the strange peace that came from accepting filth as just a part of living. It's easy now to imagine them as pitiful, but their patience was a form of strength. They endured it all without complaint, believing that hardship was as natural as breathing. Their reflection in the mirror, dim and wavering by candlelight, showed not vanity, but a quiet defiance. They lived through the kind of cold that stripped everything unnecessary away, until only necessity remained. When the fire died and the last ember faded, the smell of smoke lingered on their frozen hair. The cold pressed in again, and the castle settled into silence. The world outside waited, covered in frost, while inside, life continued in the dim glow of endurance. The memory of frozen hair and numb fingers was only one part of their struggle. Beyond the discomfort of washing, there were far less graceful ways to stay alive, ones that filled their chambers with smells that no amount of fat or herbs could ever hide. The nights inside a medieval castle were long, darker than anything we can really imagine now. The air was cold enough to make the stone itself seem to sweat, and every step echoed through these empty halls that never truly slept. In the women's chambers, the hearth burned low, its glow weak and red, barely even touching the corners of the room. The silence was broken only by the faint hiss of the fire and the slow breathing of those huddled under layers of cloth and fur. When nature called in the middle of the night, no one dared to walk through that freezing silence toward the courtyard latrine. The wind outside cut like a blade, and the stairs were treacherous with frost. So they just stayed inside. Every room had its own small pot, a personal vessel made of brass or clay or wood, placed discreetly under the bed or beside the hearth. It was an unspoken companion to every woman's night. It's both grotesque and strangely practical that the very same room for rest was also a room for waste. The pot was used quickly, quietly, often while still wrapped in blankets. Some women would sit up shivering, clutching the cold handle, while others would ask their servants to bring it closer to the bed. The act was done without any light, in a darkness so deep it blurred shame and necessity into one. The sound of liquid meeting metal or clay was faint, but it was inescapable. When they were finished, the pot was covered with a cloth or a wooden lid, though this did very little to contain the smell. By morning, the air in the room was thick and sour, a mix of smoke, sweat, and the sting of ammonia. The longer the cold lasted, the more that odor settled into everything. The bedding, the curtains, even the women's hair. Yet no one ever complained. It was simply a part of winter life, as ordinary as the frost on the windows. Some castles had servants assigned to empty the pots each morning, carrying them through narrow corridors to dump the contents into a pit or a moat. But in smaller households, it fell to the women themselves. The first breath of air when you opened the lid was enough to make your eyes water. Still, they endured it, just as they endured everything else. The cold did not forgive hesitation. The waste froze quickly, hardening into these pale crusts that clung to the sides. Sometimes the liquid would turn to slush overnight, glinting faintly in the candlelight like something mineral and clean, though it was anything but. If you compare it to today, it would be like keeping a bucket of waste beside your bed every single night and calling it a comfort, just because at least you didn't have to walk to the bathroom. There were moments when the smell became unbearable. Women near the hearth would place herbs or flowers in the pots to try and dull the odor, lavender if they had it, hay or straw if they did not. Some would sprinkle ashes from the fire into the liquid, believing it would somehow purify the contents. The effort was rarely enough. The smell clung like guilt. On warmer nights, when the fire burned a little hotter, the stench would thicken, the heat drawing it out into the air until the entire room seemed to breathe decay. Still, the practice continued. Habit was always stronger than disgust. In certain castles, especially those built on steep cliffs, there were these chutes or openings designed to throw waste directly outside. Servants would pour the contents through these holes into the open air, where it would splatter against the outer walls before freezing into uneven, yellow stains. When the sun rose, the light would catch on them, and the castle would gleam faintly gold from a distance, a kind of beauty built on filth. travelers might admire the view, never knowing what was causing that shimmer. It's one of those small historical details that is both horrifying and completely absurd. A reminder that luxury often hides behind layers of decay. The routine shaped their nights. Women learned to sleep with the smell, to turn their heads just slightly away from the pot, to breathe shallowly until dawn. In the darkest hours, when the fire died and the air turned sharp, they sometimes used the warmth of the pot itself to warm their hands before tossing the lid back on. It was a strange kind of comfort in a place that offered very little else. The pot became a part of survival, as essential as blankets or firewood. They accepted its presence without a second thought, because refusing it meant facing the cold outside, a choice no one ever made twice. There is something haunting in how quickly humans can make peace with the disgusting when the alternative is suffering. By morning, servants would open the windows briefly to let the air shift. The cold rushed in like water, biting at their faces, but it cleared the room of the stench for a few moments. They would change the straw on the floors, shake out the blankets, and return the pot to its place beneath the bed. Nothing really changed. The odor would return by nightfall, layered over by the smell of smoke and cooking fat from the kitchens below. Life inside the castle was a slow dance with discomfort. Each day was a repetition of small miseries, made normal through necessity. No one thought it was strange. Cleanliness wasn't measured by the absence of smell, but by endurance. The longer you could bear it, the stronger you were believed to be. When visitors arrived, the women would light more candles, scatter some herbs, and smile politely, as if the air around them was sweet and light. But behind every curtain, under every bed, the truth lingered quietly, reminding them of what they lived with each and every night. When the fire crackled low and the castle settled into silence again, the women pulled their blankets closer, the pot nearby like a secret they all shared. Outside, the snow fell softly against the walls that bore their hidden stains. Inside, the air thickened once more, carrying the weight of everything unspoken. The smell of survival lingered long after the night was over. And when the first light of dawn touched the frost on the window, it illuminated not cleanliness, but endurance, the quiet kind that made filth feel almost sacred. The nights in the castle were not just cold. They were intimate in their discomfort, and soon another form of impurity would return, one that could not be contained in any pot or hidden beneath any blanket. Morning inside a medieval castle began slowly, with light just creeping through these narrow slits in the stone. The air was heavy, carrying the smell of smoke, wool, and sleep. Women would wake beneath blankets still warm from the night's fire, rubbing their eyes as servants stirred the ashes in the hearth to bring the flames back to life. There was no basin of clean water waiting, no silver cup or scented soap. For most, the act of freshening up meant little more than wiping their face with a rough cloth and running their fingers through tangled hair. And when it came to the mouth, that forgotten corner of the body, the methods of keeping it clean were far from gentle. It's both pitiful and darkly funny that what they called dental care was closer to scraping a wall than actually cleaning teeth. There were no soft brushes, no minty pastes, no ritual of polished hygiene. Instead, women reached for whatever was at hand. Small twigs stripped of their bark, or simply their own fingers. Some would chew the end of a stick until it frayed, turning it into a crude sort of brush, and then use it to scrape away the film that coated their teeth after nights of eating bread, meat, and wine thick with residue. Others would rub their gums with fingertips dipped in ash or salt. The texture burned slightly, the salt stinging the tender flesh, but they believed the pain was a sign of cleansing. When neither was available, they used soil taken from the hearth, thinking its dryness would absorb any impurity. If we compare this to modern habits, it would be like brushing your teeth with a piece of sandpaper and calling it freshness. The castle's kitchens, where much of this ash and salt came from, added their own flavor to the process. The ashes still smelled of smoke and meat, and the salt was coarse, sometimes mixed with grit. Women used these same substances on their faces and their teeth, treating them as universal cures for uncleanliness. The taste would linger, bitter, metallic, and foul, but it was better than the rancid breath that came from unwashed mouths. No one expected a pleasant scent in rooms that were already filled with smoke and sweat. The air itself was too dense to notice subtleties like breath. Only when speaking very closely could one tell how deeply the castle's staleness had seeped into each person. Among the noble women, some tried to refine this routine. They'd wrap their fingers in a linen cloth soaked with wine or vinegar before rubbing their teeth, believing the acid would whiten them. It often did the exact opposite, wearing away the enamel until their teeth became sensitive to even warm broth. Still, they persisted, equating pale teeth with purity. A mouth that looked white, however brittle it was a mark of status. Servants, meanwhile, used whatever they could find. Bits of bark, a rough cloth, even straw. The work was done quickly, more from a sense of obligation than any real care. When the day's duties began, their mouths were forgotten until the next morning's cold air reminded them of the taste of sleep and smoke. The truth was, many simply stopped trying. The discomfort, the lack of any real effect, and the ever-present filth made the idea of clean teeth feel almost meaningless. Days would turn into weeks without any attempt to scrub. The film thickened, their gums bled when touched, and the smell grew stronger. But in a world where soap was rare and perfume was a luxury, bad breath was simply another scent among many. They learned to live with it, just as they lived with the chill, the hunger, and the dampness. A quiet, shared acceptance of decay. There is something strangely human in the way people can turn resignation into a routine. The only times their mouths truly felt clean were during Lent or other periods of fasting, when food itself was scarce. Hunger gave the illusion of cleanliness. With no grease to coat the tongue, the air inside their mouths felt sharp and dry, almost pure. But once the feasting returned, so did the layers of oil and spice, the sweetness of wine, and the residue that clung to every surface. The teeth became stained, the gums inflamed, and yet life went on. The women smiled when they were required to, their lips pressed tightly to hide what lay behind them. Mirrors were rare, and candlelight was forgiving. A dim reflection couldn't betray what the shadows already hid. Decay in that age was quiet. It began unseen and often ended unnoticed. Teeth loosened, gums receded, and eventually they would just fall away, one by one. There were no dentists, no replacements, only the slow adaptation of the mouth to emptiness. Softer food, smaller bites, and fewer smiles. And in those stone halls, where survival overshadowed comfort, even that was considered normal. What mattered was endurance, not elegance. They lived knowing that every single bite might hurt, but they chewed anyway. It's tempting to feel superior now, surrounded by comforts they could never have imagined. But their struggle wasn't about ignorance. It was about adaptation. They didn't lack knowledge so much as they lacked options. The cold, the scarcity, the crude tools. These things shaped their understanding of what clean could even mean. Clean wasn't a smell or a feeling. It was a temporary escape from discomfort, achieved by any means necessary. When the castle settled into silence at night, the air thick with smoke and fatigue, the faint scent of salt and ash still lingered. It clung to their fingers, their lips, and the rough fabric that served as their towels. And when they finally closed their eyes, the taste of soot and vinegar remained, a reminder that even the smallest act of care came with a price. The act of cleaning their teeth wasn't about vanity, but survival. A small defiance against decay. Yet the more they tried to fight it, the more decay reminded them that it always won in the end. The mouth, after all, was only one part of a body that was constantly at war with its own filth. And beneath those many layers of fabric, something far more personal was struggling for attention. How to manage the monthly burden that no amount of salt or ash could ever cleanse. Winter in a medieval castle did not pause for the body's natural rhythms. Even as frost crept across the stone floors and water froze in jugs, life inside the walls just went on. For women, that meant enduring their monthly bleeding in conditions so harsh that every part of it turned into a quiet battle against the cold. There was no comfort, no softness, and absolutely no privacy. The air was too damp to dry cloth, too cold to wash anything properly, and yet their bodies didn't care about the season's cruelty. What should have been a simple matter of biology became another form of suffering, woven into their daily lives. It's grimly ironic that the very cycle of life itself became most unbearable in the season that was closest to death. The rags they used were not clean, not sterile, and certainly not disposable. These pieces of cloth were cut from old garments, often coarse linen that had already served its purpose many times over. When they bled, the fabric absorbed very little before turning stiff and dark. Washing them meant plunging their hands into near-frozen water that numbed the skin right to the bone. They would scrub until their fingers cracked, and then hang the cloths near the hearth to dry. But even there, the cold crept in. The air was just too wet, the heat from the fire too weak. The rags would freeze stiff before they had a chance to dry completely, with tiny little ice crystals forming in the folds. When they thawed, they carried a musty, sour smell that never really left. The women used them again anyway, because there simply was no alternative. Some tried to warm the cloths directly over the fire, spreading them on wooden sticks or laying them across the hearthstone. If they got too close, the fabric burned, leaving dark patches and curling edges. Too far, and the dampness lingered. There was no right balance, only a compromise. The smell of singed cloth mingled with the ever-present smoke, becoming another part of the castle's winter scent. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like trying to dry sanitary pads over a campfire and pretending the result was safe. The women did what they could, not out of choice, but out of sheer necessity, transforming their chambers into these strange mixtures of warmth, blood, and ash. There were no pins or belts to keep the cloths in place. Layers of skirts, petticoats, and undergarments were supposed to hold them, but any movement could dislodge everything. A wrong step or a sudden bend could send the cloth slipping down to the floor, leaving both shame and stains behind. Servants learned to walk carefully, to sit and rise slowly. Some even tied strings or strips of linen around their thighs, desperate for some stability. Others used small bundles of wool, though these soaked through quickly and froze just as fast. Each method carried its own risk, its own discomfort. And a deep silence surrounded it all, because such matters were not spoken of, not even among women. Pain and inconvenience were just expected, and so they simply endured them. In noble households, scented oils or herbs might be used to try and disguise the odor. Lavender, mint, or rosemary was tucked into pockets and sleeves, their faint sweetness fighting a losing battle against decay. Poorer women relied on ashes again, sprinkling them on the cloth to dry the blood faster. The result was abrasive and painful. But in an age where suffering was constant, a little more pain seemed insignificant. Their bodies grew used to it. The irritation, the rashes, the infections. They were all normal, as common as cold fingers and chapped lips. The act of washing after each cycle was equally grim. The frozen water left a residue, and the soap, when it was available, was made from animal fat mixed with lye. It burned more than it cleaned. The smell of it clung to the skin, sharp and caustic, even after the blood had stopped. The sense of being dirty remained. There was no real feeling of renewal, only the brief relief of knowing the worst had passed. And then came the dread of waiting for the next month, the next battle against the cold and the body's persistence. No man understood the extent of this endurance. It was a private suffering, hidden beneath layers of wool and silence. Women were expected to continue their chores, to serve meals, to sew, to pray, and to smile when they were spoken to. The blood was invisible only because their skirts were so long. The dampness beneath them stayed trapped, warming against the skin for a moment before cooling again into a clammy discomfort. It was a rhythm of misery, tolerated in the same way they tolerated hunger and exhaustion. Some chronicles mention that women of higher rank had attendants who would dispose of the rags or clean them. But this luxury offered little real comfort. The same process was just repeated, only in different hands. The smell, the dampness, the endless cycle. It belonged to everyone, noble or not. Cleanliness was impossible. Modesty demanded silence, and silence ensured that nothing ever changed. When the frost was thick enough to cover the windows, the rags would freeze solid overnight if they were left unattended. They would crack when handled, the frozen stains glittering faintly in the candlelight. By morning they were soaked again, thawing slowly in the stale warmth of the hearth. Each winter brought the same pattern, freezing, thawing, freezing again. By spring the fabric was ruined, stiff with age and odor. Still they were kept, washed one more time and returned to use. There was no waste in poverty. Even filth was recycled. There is something deeply unsettling in how the body's most natural act was treated as a secret curse, rather than a need for care. The castle's women lived through it quietly, turning necessity into strength and shame into habit. They bled in silence, washed in freezing water, and slept beside the smell of smoke and blood, all because survival left no room for gentleness. When the cold finally eased and the spring sunlight touched the walls again, the cycle continued just as it always had. Nothing truly changed. Only the air grew warmer, making the suffering a little less visible, but no less real. The body's endurance had its limits, and soon it would show in other ways. The skin, after months of cold and grime, began to change, carrying the marks of a winter spent too close to the fire and too far from cleanliness. Every chamber inside a medieval castle carried its own particular scent, a mixture of smoke, dampness, and the slow decay of daily life. Yet each room also had something more personal, an odor that belonged to the person who lived there. In the corner of nearly every woman's chamber sat a small bucket or a wooden pail, filled with the quiet remains of their private routines. It held scraps of linen used for cleaning, pieces of cloth too soiled to wash immediately, and ashes mixed with grease from their attempts at personal hygiene. There was no sewage system, no running water to carry the waste away. Everything just stayed where it was until the weather permitted its removal. It's both astonishing and a little absurd that the whole idea of cleanliness depended entirely on whether or not the sun decided to appear. These buckets were more than just containers. They were silent witnesses to the reality of life inside those stone walls, collecting not only waste, but the very smell of survival. When the air outside froze and the wind howled through the cracks, the buckets remained indoors. Lids were pressed down tight or covered with a folded cloth, but no lid could hold the odor in completely. By night, the smell would creep into the bedding and clothing, into the wooden furniture that absorbed it like a sponge. Each morning, women would stir the ashes inside to try and mask the stench, pretending that it helped. Sometimes they sprinkled herbs over the top, dried mint, lavender, or thyme. But the scent of rot always returned, softened perhaps, but never gone. The problem wasn't the existence of dirt, but its permanence. There was simply nowhere for it to go. Wastewater, ashes, and spoiled food were all collected in these small vessels, until a rare day of sunlight allowed the servants to empty them into the courtyard. Even then, the process was unpleasant. The cold made the contents semi-solid, sticking to the sides in streaks of brown and gray. Servants scraped them out with wooden spoons or bits of metal, gagging quietly as they worked. Once it was emptied, the bucket was rinsed with cold water and a handful of sand before being returned to its place, ready to begin the cycle all over again. If we were to compare it to modern life, it would be like keeping your trash can, your laundry basket, and your toilet all in the same corner of your bedroom and just calling that normal. For the women who lived among these smells, the human nose adapted. What once seemed unbearable became ordinary. The scent of decay stopped meaning filth and started meaning home. They learned to distinguish between the odors, the sharp bite of ash, the sourness of sweat, the faint sweetness of dried herbs that were trying and failing to dominate them all. Even the smoke from the hearth was part of the blend, a layer that covered everything like a curtain. To step outside after weeks spent indoors was to be shocked by the freshness of the air, and yet many found it uncomfortable, too empty, too clean. Inside, their own smell was familiar, a quiet reassurance that they still existed in the middle of so much stone and frost. Visitors noticed, of course. When guests arrived from other castles, they often carried their own smell with them, a different mixture of smoke and waste that told its own story. The meeting of these odors in a single hall created a strange mosaic of scents, the perfume of medieval life. It clung to fabrics, to hair, to the skin of anyone who stayed long enough. No amount of washing could erase it entirely. The castle itself absorbed it, stone by stone, until even the walls carried a memory of the people who had lived there. Long after a room was emptied, its smell remained, a ghostly reminder of the bodies that had once filled it. In the absence of soap and sanitation, women developed these small rituals of control. Some hung cloth sachets filled with herbs near their beds. Others burned dried flowers in shallow bowls of coals, hopping to replace one smell with another. A few even rubbed scented oils mixed with fat onto their wrists and necks, thinking it might shield them from the odor that surrounded everything. These gestures were more about dignity than they were about success. The smell always won, but pretending it could be defeated gave them a sense of power in a life where control was so rare. There is something quietly admirable in the way they fought decay with such stubborn grace, even when defeat was certain. The servants' quarters were worse. Their buckets filled faster, were emptied less often, and sometimes overflowed when the weather stayed dark for weeks on end. The scent of human waste mixed with straw and wet wool, until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Yet even the noble women's rooms were not free from this reality. Comfort in a castle was relative, and every wall hid the same secret. Waste was kept close because the cold forbade any distance. By spring, when the frost finally released its grip, the air changed. The buckets were scrubbed clean, the linens were washed in running streams, and for a few weeks the rooms felt lighter. But the smell never disappeared entirely. It was baked into the wood, soaked into the floor, and trapped in the fabrics that could never be fully washed. Cleanliness, like warmth, was temporary, a luxury that faded the moment the next storm arrived. Over time, this constant closeness to waste shaped more than just their sense of smell. It changed the way they thought about their bodies. The line between what was pure and what was foul simply blurred. To them, being clean wasn't about scent or sight, but about endurance, the ability to live amid filth without complaint. They learned to treat smell as background noise, the quiet hum of existence within walls that protected them from death, but never from decay. The castle's air was heavy with these lessons. Each room breathed with its occupant. Each bucket told its story, and together they formed a portrait of life stripped down to its bare essentials. When the last ember dimmed and the night settled in, the smell remained patient and honest. And as the cold months stretched on, the women who lived there learned that the price of safety was simply learning to live with what others would run from. Their bodies, their rooms, and their breath all carried the same scent of survival. Yet beneath that layer of familiarity, something deeper lingered. The slow rot of the walls themselves, where even the air began to taste of time. The smell of a medieval castle was its own living thing. It crept through the stone corridors, hid behind tapestries, and lingered in every seam of cloth and every breath drawn inside its walls. The scent was not just one thing, but many. Sweat, smoke, damp air, and the slow burn of wood that never quite dried. The cold stones that made the castle strong also made it impossible to escape the smells trapped within them. They absorbed everything, holding the breath of generations. Even the silence had an odor there, faintly metallic, like wet iron and ash. It's almost poetic, in a cruel sort of way, that the very walls built to protect life also preserved the smell of its decay. The source of the scent began with the people, layers of bodies wrapped in wool, linen, and fur, who exhaled a heat into the air that could never fully leave. Sweat clung to the fabric, and the fabric clung to the skin, until both carried the same heavy sweetness of flesh that had been left too long unwashed. When the women moved through the corridors, they stirred these faint trails of warmth and musk behind them. It wasn't the sharp stench of filth, but something duller, thicker, more human. Over time, the moisture from their bodies soaked into the stone itself. The castle walls, porous and cold, held that moisture like a pair of lungs. Each winter added another layer to the invisible history of smell that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Then came the fire, the heart of the castle and the maker of its haze. The logs cut months before were now soaked through with snow and rain. And when they burned, they did not burn clean. The smoke was thick, oily, and dark, filling the great halls and winding staircases until it settled on every single surface like a fine layer of soot. The women's hair smelled of it. Their beds smelled of it. Even their breath carried it. In the kitchens, the fires mixed smoke with the scent of roasting meat, which was often cooked well past its prime. The smell of burning fat clung to everything. Above the kitchen, the odor rose up through cracks in the ceiling, spreading upward in these slow waves. If we were to compare it to modern life, it would be like living inside a chimney that also doubled as a stable and a pantry. The stables themselves contributed their own perfume. Horse manure and straw blended into this constant undertone of earth and ammonia. When the wind shifted, it would carry this scent into the lower halls, where it mingled with the smoke and sweat already hanging there. The result wasn't entirely unpleasant. It was simply alive. Life in the castle was inseparable from these smells. They reminded everyone that warmth came from fire, food came from animals, and survival came from accepting both the noble and the foul without any complaint. Each floor had its own distinct odor. The lower levels were dense with smoke, meat, and animal waste. The middle chambers smelled of wet fabric and skin. The upper rooms, where the air was thinner and colder, carried the faintest scent of candle wax and mildew. No amount of herbs or incense could ever erase the layering of these elements. Servants would burn dried rosemary. Nobles would light perfumed candles when they could afford them, but both efforts only added a layer of sweetness to the stench. The result was a strange mixture, half rot, half spice, that became the castle's signature aroma. Guests who entered for the first time often hesitated, expecting the grandeur of legend and finding instead the closeness of a life lived too near to itself. The air felt thick, almost chewable. But within hours, they would grow accustomed to it, their senses surrendering to what could not be escaped. To live in a castle was to surrender to smell. Clean air belonged to the world outside, to the fields and forests, to the poor peasants who froze in their huts without stone walls, but slept under stars that did not stink of smoke. There was also the smell of death. Quiet, faint, but always there. Small animals would creep into corners to die in the warmth, unnoticed until the heat made their presence known. Mold grew on the walls where the dampness never dried. The wood of chairs and tables held the scent of the bodies that had sat on them for decades. Even the holy spaces, the castle chapels where prayers rose daily, smelled of candle soot and cold stone rather than purity. The sacred was never clean. It was only quieter. And yet people loved these smells because they were signs of safety. The stench of smoke meant a fire was burning. The odor of sweat meant the body still lived. The scent of the castle became a comfort, a shield against the emptiness of winter. When someone left the castle and traveled for days in the open air, they spoke of missing it. The closeness, the warmth, even the stink. It was home. There's something strangely tender in how the human mind can turn confinement and odor into a sense of belonging. The mingling of smells told a story of survival. Each season added a new note. The dampness of spring, the rot of summer stores, the the smoke of autumn fires and the frozen breath of winter. The castle's aroma was like a memory that could not fade. Every breath carried centuries of lives that had been lived, labored, and lost inside those walls. It was history not written down, but inhaled. As night fell, the fires burned low again and the air thickened. The smell of smoke and sweat grew heavier, pressing against the stone like another kind of darkness. The women lying in their beds breathed it in without a second thought. To them it was simply air, the same air they had always known, the same air that had kept them alive. The castle smelled of life, dense, imperfect, and enduring. But somewhere within that blend of fire and flesh, another scent was waiting to rise, one that lived closer to the skin and hid beneath the layers of fabric, multiplying quietly in the warmth beneath the thick wool hoods and sleeping caps that women wore through the long medieval winters. Something else lived quietly, multiplying in the warmth. The very same fabric that kept them from freezing also sheltered colonies of lice and fleas. The caps were rarely washed, often never washed at all, because water was precious and the cold was too severe. Each thread held the smell of smoke, sweat, and oil from hair that hadn't been cleaned in months. What could not be seen was ignored, and what could not be tolerated was just accepted. It's both disturbing and strangely predictable that comfort and infestation shared the very same space beneath a woman's hat. The wool itself was thick and coarse, woven tightly to hold warmth against the skin. But warmth drew life. Once a few insects found their way in, they multiplied quickly, laying their eggs deep within the fibers where fingers could not reach. The itching began as just a nuisance, and then grew into a constant torment. Women would scratch until their skin reddened, their nails filled with tiny flecks of dried blood. In the dim light of the hearth, they would comb their hair with wooden teeth, watching the little creatures fall into the fire and vanish with a faint hiss. The act was part grooming, part exorcism. It gave momentary relief, but never victory. The infestation spread easily. Pillows, scarves, veils, and even the beds carried the same tiny passengers. The servants who dressed noble women were often the first to suffer, their own caps crawling by night. But no rank, no wealth, no perfume could stop it. The heat of the human body was simply irresistible, and the layers of clothing offered endless hiding places. Some women rubbed oil or animal fat onto their scalps, believing it would suffocate the lice. It sometimes worked, though the smell lingered and the grease just attracted more dust. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like coating your head in cooking oil and calling it medicine. Yet to them, it was better than nothing. Anything was better than the itching. Others sought more drastic solutions. A few noble women shaved their heads completely during the coldest months, preferring baldness hidden beneath wigs or hoods to the misery of infestation. Beneath their wigs, their scalps often broke out in sores from the friction and the lack of air. Still, it was a kind of relief, a brief escape from that crawling feeling on their skin. Servants, unable to afford such solutions, simply endured. They would pick through their hair each night, crushing what they found between their fingernails, then rubbing ashes or vinegar on the scalp to soothe the irritation. The smell of vinegar mixed with smoke became another familiar note in the castle's already heavy air. The warmth that bred the insects also kept them alive in the bedding. Mattresses filled with straw were perfect nests. Each stalk was a little ladder for the tiny creatures. Women sometimes slept with their heads wrapped in linen to keep the pests from crawling into their ears or mouths. But the fabric offered very little protection. The lice thrived in the dark, feeding and breeding with a persistence that mocked every attempt to destroy them. The more they scratched, the more the creatures spread. And by morning, the cycle would begin all over again. The presence of lice wasn't a mark of shame. It was simply a fact of life. Everyone had them. The wealthy might speak of them with embarrassment, but they were as common as smoke or dust. The castle doctor, if there was one, might recommend vinegar baths or ointments made from herbs, but such treatments were luxuries that few followed regularly. The cold water alone was enough to discourage even the bravest from washing their heads. The parasites, cleverer than anyone realized, knew how to wait. They endured the heat of the fire, the bite of vinegar, the sting of ash, and when the conditions improved, they simply returned. The constant itching became a kind of rhythm, a part of the day. Women would scratch while talking, while sewing, while praying. It was almost graceful in its normality. No one commented. The sound of nails on skin was as ordinary as the crackle of firewood. They learned to live with it, just as they lived with hunger and cold. A quiet mutual understanding between suffering and survival. There is something deeply human in how easily the body learns to tolerate its own discomfort when it has no other choice. In the rare moments of solitude, a woman might remove her cap and examine it in the light of the hearth. Tiny shadows would be moving across the threads. She would sigh, pinch one between her nails, and toss it into the flames. The satisfaction lasted for seconds. By dawn, there would be more. The cycle of life continued within the very fabric that was protecting her from death. Warmth and decay, comfort and disgust. They existed together, inseparable. When spring finally came and the air softened, some would burn their old caps, watching the wool curl and blacken in the fire. The smell of burning hair filled the room, sharp and strangely freeing. For a brief moment, the air felt clean. But before long, the next winter would return, bringing back the need for warmth and the quiet scratching that always followed it. The castle was not just a home to people. It was a living ecosystem, thriving with all forms of life, both seen and unseen. Each creature, no matter how small, had found a way to share in the warmth that the humans created. And the women, caught between disgust and necessity, learned that the line between survival and squalor was thinner than the thread of a woolen cap. The same air that carried smoke and sweat now carried life itself, in miniature. And as they slept, wrapped in their furs and their dreams, something continued to move just beneath the surface, feeding on the very warmth that was keeping them alive. In the dim light of a castle chamber, where the air was always thick with smoke and dampness, women turned to strange rituals in the hope of staying healthy. Among the many private habits that were whispered from one noble household to another, one stood out for its odd mixture of superstition, discomfort, and faith in warmth. It was the practice of sitting over a smoldering pile of herbs and straw, allowing the rising heat to cleanse what they believed could not be cleaned any other way. The method was simple and crude. A wooden chair with a hole cut in the seat, a small pot or basket placed beneath it, and a servant tending to the slow burn. It's almost unbelievable that what began as an attempt at healing so often ended as an act of quiet torture. The purpose was not pleasure, but prevention. In an age without doctors for women, without medicine that truly understood the female body, warmth was the cure for everything. Cold was the enemy. It brought stiffness and pain and infection. To feel warm was to feel safe. So they would sit above the smoke, lifting their skirts and closing their eyes, breathing through the heat that climbed up toward them. Beneath the chair, dried straw and herbs burned just enough to release steam and scent. The smoke would curl upward, touching the skin, and for a brief moment the warmth might have felt soothing. Then it would burn. The line between relief and pain was thin, and it was easily crossed by a servant adding too much fuel or by a spark that flared too high. The ingredients were always a mystery, changing from one household to the next. Some used rosemary, sage, or mint, claiming their scent drove away illness. Others burned crushed petals mixed with animal fat, believing the smoke purified more deeply. The wealthiest would add fragments of precious resins, like amber, myrrh, or frankincense, to mask the smell of burning straw with something closer to incense. The poorer women used whatever they could find. Dried weeds, scraps of hay, even bits of wool soaked in wine were set to burn beneath them. The scent of it all mixed into something oddly human, half sacred and half foul, lingering long after the fire died. If we compare it to today, it would be like sitting over a candle that was scented with medicine and pretending that it was health care. Servants performed most of the work. They would crouch beside the chair, feeding straw into the pot and fanning the smoke gently upward. The air would shimmer with heat, and the sound of crackling straw would fill the silence. For the women seated above, the experience was both humiliating and intensely private. They endured it quietly, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes closing their eyes to imagine the warmth as some kind of healing light. Others just gritted their teeth against the sting, knowing that the pain was supposed to mean the body was being cleansed. When the session was over, they would rise slowly, their skin flushed and trembling, unsure whether the sensation they felt was health or harm. The ritual spread through the castles like a rumor. Midwives recommended it for all manner of ailments: itching, swelling, fatigue, even melancholy. It was said to restore fertility, to purify after childbirth, to make the body feel light again. In truth, it likely caused more damage than relief. Burns were common, though few ever admitted to them. Infection followed easily when the skin blistered. Still, the practice continued. The discomfort was easier to bear than the fear of sickness. A woman who refused to take part was often seen as careless or unclean, unwilling to tend to her own body. In a world that was ruled by belief rather than knowledge, pain was proof of virtue. The smell of the ritual clung to the rooms where it was done. The air afterward was thick with a mixture of herbs and scorched wood, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter. For a short while, it would cover the castle's other odors: the smoke, the sweat, and the waste. But soon it just joined them. It became one more layer in the fabric of the castle's scent, another mark of survival that was disguised as refinement. The noble women liked to think of it as a mark of class, a secret practice of the educated and the well-born. In truth, it was just desperation wearing perfume. Even the servants, when the castle grew quiet, sometimes tried it themselves, though without the luxury of herbs. They used only straw that was stolen from the stables. The heat burned harsher, and the smell was worse. But for a few moments, they felt the same false sense of control over their own bodies. The line between the noble and the poor blurred in that shared illusion. The belief that warmth could wash away the dirt that no water could reach. There is something heartbreakingly human in how pain can become a comfort when hope runs out. When the ritual ended, the ashes were gathered and thrown into the fire, and life returned to its ordinary discomforts. The women dressed again in their layers of wool, hiding the red marks beneath fabric and silence. No one spoke of the burns, only of the purity they believed they had earned. The body, they thought, had to be disciplined to be clean, as if suffering itself could somehow create virtue. The next day, the castle smelled once more of smoke and skin, the air no cleaner, the body no safer. But the memory of the warmth lingered, and with it, the illusion of health. They would do it again when the itch returned, when the midwife whispered it was time, or when the fear of decay grew too strong to ignore. The castle was a world where the boundary between medicine and harm was drawn by desperation. Heat, pain, and faith became one and the same. And through it all, the women learned that their survival depended not on what healed them, but on what they could endure. The smoke had faded, but the marks it left behind would not. And elsewhere in the castle, the same fire that burned beneath them was used again, this time for something far stranger: to create beauty out of blood. The search for warmth and beauty in a medieval winter often crossed into places that now feel unthinkable. Inside the stone chambers of the castles, where the air was thick with smoke and the cold bit through every layer of cloth, women turned to whatever the world around them offered. When their skin cracked and peeled in the dry air, they found a remedy that felt both sacred and grotesque. Warm blood from a duck or a chicken, freshly drawn and still steaming, was heated gently over the hearth until it thickened slightly. Then it was mixed with ash into a dark paste. The women would touch it with their fingers and spread it carefully across their faces, as if they were painting life back onto skin that had been drained of color by the winter. It is a bitter kind of irony that they fought death's chill by smearing its very essence upon their own cheeks. The mixture was thought to have power. Blood was warmth. Blood was vitality, and warmth was life. To rub it into the skin was to borrow some of that strength, to seal it beneath the surface before the cold could take it away. The ash, soft and gray, added texture and kept the mixture from dripping. Together, they formed a mask that dried quickly, tightening across the face like a second skin. The smell was strong. Iron and smoke, and something faintly sweet. But to those who used it, it was the scent of preservation. The noble women called it the living salve. The servants called it something else entirely, though never aloud. They were the ones who had to fetch the blood, pluck the feathers, and stir the pot, watching as life turned into beauty, one ladle at a time. The warmth of the blood gave an immediate illusion of health. Their faces would flush red, not from youth, but from what was clinging to them. The glow that followed looked real enough in the dim light of candles and fire. When the mixture dried, it left a soft sheen, as if the skin had been polished. The women would touch their cheeks and imagine softness. They didn't see the thin film of ash settling into their pores, or the way the blood stiffened into a faint crust. In their mirrors of burnished metal, everything looked alive. If we compare it to today, it would be like using warm animal fat and charcoal as skincare, and convincing yourself it was a luxury. Some claimed the blood did more than just soften the skin. It was said to keep away illness, to feed the face, even to preserve youth. A few believed it could hide the scent of menstrual blood, which many thought corrupted the air around them. To them, one kind of blood canceled out another. The idea made sense in a world where science had not yet reached the castle walls. The connection between purity and pain, between warmth and rot, shaped their understanding of beauty. What mattered was not comfort, but endurance. The willingness to do what others could not. The ritual was intimate and unpleasant. A servant would bring a bowl of the steaming liquid, its surface rippling with heat. The lady would dip her fingers in, sometimes flinching at the touch, then lift the mixture to her face. She would work slowly, covering her forehead, her cheeks, and her neck. The warmth soothed her briefly, but it soon cooled into a clamminess. The blood would thicken in the air, drying darker and cracking when she moved her mouth or smiled. The residue often left faint stains that lingered for days, especially near the hairline. Still, she would do it again each morning, repeating the act as faithfully as a prayer. When her face began to itch, she would rinse it off with wine or melted snow, rubbing hard to remove the dried film. The water would turn red, streaked with ash, as if she were washing away more than just dirt. The basin below would catch what looked like the remnants of violence, though it was only vanity. The servants would pour it out, the crimson liquid freezing against the stones outside. No one thought it was strange. Blood belonged to life, and life meant warmth, and warmth was all that mattered. Over time, the smell of iron mixed with that of the hearth. The skin beneath grew rougher, not smoother. But in the dimness of winter, flaws were easy to ignore. The candlelight softened everything. A pale face dusted with ash and blood looked almost luminous, the kind of beauty that was born from deprivation and belief. It was a beauty that could only exist in the dark. Some women whispered that the practice was not entirely theirs, that they had learned it from older servants, from midwives, from women who had seen too much death to fear blood anymore. They spoke of it quietly, as though they were passing down a secret between generations of survivors. In those conversations, beauty and survival became the same thing. The blood wasn't glamour, it was armor. There is something strangely moving in the thought that beneath all their fear and their superstition, these women were simply trying to stay alive in a world that never cared to make them comfortable. They believed that warmth could be bottled, or rubbed, or painted onto the skin. And who could blame them in a season where water froze before it even touched the ground? Anything warm felt holy. When spring finally came, the ritual faded away, replaced by sunlight and air that didn't cut the flesh. But the memory of what they did lingered in the smell of the rooms where it was practiced. Even as new blood dried and old stains faded, the idea remained that beauty could be drawn from what was once alive. The women of the castle lived surrounded by contradiction. The same hands that spread blood on their faces also touched ashes and waste and decay. And soon, those hands would return to the same beds each night, where cleanliness was a luxury and rest came with a smell all its own. The beds of a medieval castle were not places of comfort, but of slow decay, disguised by layers of fabric. Each mattress was a world of its own, stuffed with straw that flattened over time and grew dark with use. Beneath the linen sheets and the woolen blankets, the bed breathed dust, ash, and the remains of living. Every night, bodies pressed warmth into the layers, leaving behind sweat, oil, flakes of skin, and strands of hair that settled deep into the stuffing. When the women of the castle lay down, they were not resting on softness, but on a history of months, sometimes years, of their own residue. It's both unsettling and oddly fitting that what was meant to cradle the body slowly turned into a museum of its own decay. No one ever truly washed a bed. It was impossible. The mattresses were too heavy, the air was too cold, and water was too rare. When the surface became too grimy, they would change the top sheet or shake it out near the fire to chase away the worst of the smell. The straw inside remained untouched until it became unbearable, at which point servants would carry it outside to be emptied and refilled. But this happened rarely, often only when insects began to crawl from the seams. Most of the time, the beds were simply refreshed by flipping the mattress or scattering fresh herbs across it. Thyme, mint, or rosemary, to trick the senses into thinking cleanliness had returned. Every movement on the bed sent small clouds of dust into the air. In the flickering light of the candles, the particles would glimmer like ash. And they were ash in part, tiny remnants of the hearth that found their way into every corner of the room. The same air that carried warmth from the fire also carried soot, which settled on skin, clothes, and bedding alike. When women woke up in the morning, the outlines of their heads could be seen on the pillows, faint marks of sweat and soot shaping the place where their dreams had lain. They would brush at them lightly, knowing there was no use. By nightfall, the marks would just return. The beds themselves were made of wooden frames that creaked with every shift of weight. Beneath them, the floor collected whatever fell. Hairs, fabric scraps, and dust that had thickened over weeks of neglect. Servants used dry branches to sweep beneath the frames, pushing the debris into corners or gathering it into piles for burning. If you compare it to modern life, it would be like cleaning your bed with a bundle of sticks and calling it spring cleaning. It was the only method they had. Water was too precious to waste on scrubbing, and soap was reserved for the skin, not the furniture. The branches would crack softly as they brushed against the straw and wood, their sound merging with the constant whisper of the fire nearby. When winter deepened, ash became a part of the bedding itself. The fine gray dust from the hearth drifted upward, carried by the drafts that crept through every crack in the stone. It settled on blankets and in their hair, coating everything with a faint shimmer. Sometimes the women would shake out their bedding near the fire, but this only stirred more particles into the air. The line between warmth and filth disappeared completely. The hearth that kept them alive was the same thing that filled their lungs with smoke and covered their resting place in residue. The women learned to ignore the discomfort. It was just easier that way. They lay in beds that smelled of smoke and skin, pulling the heavy covers close and breathing through the musty air. When they turned, the straw would rustle softly, whispering of age and use. Hair clung to the edges of the blankets, caught in the seams or twisted around threads. Even when it was brushed away, more would appear by morning. It was a constant shedding of life, a slow reminder that the body was never separate from the place where it slept. There is something strangely intimate about the idea that every night's rest left a trace of the person who had endured it. Cleaning day was its own ordeal. Servants would lift the heavy mattresses, shaking them near open windows or the hearth if the weather was too harsh. The air would fill with dust and tiny fragments of fabric, glittering in the sunlight or the smoke. They would cough, their eyes watering, but they continued the work. The women oversaw it all from a distance, covering their mouths with their sleeves. They knew the smell would not leave, only lessen. The refreshed bed still held the memory of what came before. The ashes, the oil, the faint metallic scent of sweat that could never truly be erased. To sleep in such a place required a kind of surrender. The body learned to accept what could not be changed, to find rest in the midst of discomfort. The noise of the fire, the creak of the wood, the scratch of the straw. These became the lullabies of necessity. And in that uneasy sleep, they dreamed not of softness, but of survival. By spring, the straw inside the mattresses would begin to sprout tiny shoots from all the moisture trapped within. Mold bloomed unseen in the seams. The women would turn their beds once more, scattering fresh herbs as though faith alone could mask the decay. The cycle continued. Shed cover, breathe, endure. The bed was no longer a place of rest, but a quiet reminder that comfort, like cleanliness, was temporary. When night came and the fires burned low, the castle's rooms filled again with the faint scent of ash and human life. The women lay down, their eyes half closed, sinking into that familiar blend of warmth and residue. The sheets crackled faintly beneath them, heavy with dust and memory. They slept not in freshness, but in the ghosts of their own skin. The ashes of the hearth touched every surface, even the ones that were meant for rest. But it wasn't only the beds that carried the marks of decay. In the corner of the room, another tool of vanity was waiting, holding its own secrets of rust, injury, and infection. In the private corners of those cold stone chambers, where the only light came from a flickering fire, women would kneel before small mirrors of polished metal and perform the quiet ritual of removing hair. There were no razors shaped for the task, no gentle blades or creams, only fragments of sharpened metal. Sometimes the edge of a broken knife, sometimes a strip of iron that had been ground thin and glinted faintly in the firelight. These were tools made for cutting meat or trimming cloth, now pressed against the skin with a kind of faith that bordered on recklessness. It's almost tragic that the pursuit of beauty so often began with a wound. The practice wasn't for vanity alone. Hair was seen as a mark of impurity, something to be tamed and hidden. Smoothness meant control, and control was the language of status. The noble women of the castle took pride in the pale, bare skin that marked them as refined, different from the peasants who labored outside. Yet behind closed doors, their methods were crude. They would heat the metal briefly over the fire, not to sterilize it. They didn't even know the word, but to soften the edge. Then they would drag it across their skin, slow and deliberate, shaving away what nature had placed there. The fire hissed softly as the metal cooled, and in that silence, the faint sound of scraping flesh filled the air. Cuts were inevitable. The skin, already dry from the cold, broke easily under the pressure. Thin red lines would appear across the thighs, underarms, or arms, seeping just enough to sting. Some would dab the wounds with rags dipped in wine or even urine, believing it would cleanse the flesh. Others just ignored the pain, letting it scab over beneath the layers of wool and linen. Infections followed, subtle at first. An ache, a heat beneath the skin, a swelling that grew over days. The women blamed the air, the cold, or fate, never imagining that their own tools carried the very danger they sought to avoid. The rusted blades were never truly clean. They were stored in small boxes lined with cloth and used again and again until their edges dulled. Servants would sharpen them on stones, scraping until sparks flew, unaware that each use left behind more iron dust to grind into the wounds. Still, the ritual continued. It was better to risk pain than to appear unkempt. In a world that measured virtue by appearance, the body itself became a battlefield. If you compare it to today, it would be like scraping your skin with a kitchen knife and calling it refinement. Those who could afford a little luxury tried to disguise the damage, rather than prevent it. A few noble women would apply thin sheets of silver or gold leaf over the freshly shaved areas. The metal would gleam softly under the candlelight, hiding any redness and small scabs. It was said that silver purified the flesh and gold preserved youth. In truth, the delicate foils stuck to the skin only until sweat loosened them, leaving behind a faint metallic smell. Beneath the shimmer, the flesh was raw, but in the mirror they looked perfect, pale, glowing, and untouchable. The illusion mattered more than the ache beneath it. Servants often handled the most dangerous parts of the process. They would hold small lamps near the skin, their hands trembling as the blade glided across their mistress's arm or neck. A single slip could draw blood, yet the punishment for hesitation was harsh. The scent of iron, fire, and perfume blended in the air until beauty and pain became indistinguishable. When it was over, the servants would wash the tools in cold water, wiping them with cloths that were already gray from use. The blades were then left to dry by the fire, where rust would spread like a bruise across their surface. By the next week, they would be used again. There were superstitions about hair removal, whispered among the women when no men were near. Some believed that cutting hair or shaving the body could anger spirits or bring weakness. Others thought that hair carried illness, and removing it was a way to cleanse the soul. Both ideas existed together, overlapping like the flicker of light and shadow across a wall. Whether it was out of fear or pride, every woman did it differently. Some in silence, others with small muttered prayers for steady hands. The act itself became a kind of confession, a private acknowledgement of how much they were willing to suffer to meet the invisible demands of beauty. The castle air did not help the wounds heal. The cold kept the blood sluggish, and the ever-present smoke from the hearth settled on any open skin. Infection was common, but it often went unnoticed until it turned dangerous. A patch of flesh would redden, then darken, then begin to ooze faintly under the fabric. The doctors, if they came at all, blamed it on impure humors. The true cause remained hidden behind centuries of misunderstanding. Still, the women endured, never questioning the cost. They learned to cover the scars with powder or cloth, turning injury into an ornament. There is something painfully familiar in the way they mistook damage for beauty. Even now, across all these centuries, the pattern hasn't entirely changed. The tools are different, the methods are cleaner, but the idea remains the same. That to be admired, a woman must carve herself into a certain shape, no matter what is lost in the process. When night fell, the tools were put away, wrapped in linen and placed near the fire to dry. The room grew quiet again, the faint scent of iron lingering like a secret. The women would lie in their beds, their skin stinging under the layers of cloth, their thoughts already drifting toward the morning, when the mirror would once again demand proof of control. The rusted blades would sleep beside them, waiting. And when dawn came, they would gleam once more, ready to draw new lines across the skin that dared to grow wild. When the skin broke, and it often did in the cold, stone world of the castle, there was very little to protect it. Cuts came from work, from rough fabric, from dull blades used too many times, and every single one of them carried the same quiet danger. Infection was invisible until it was too late. A scratch could swell, redden, and pulse with heat beneath the chill air, turning from a small irritation into a slow, aching sickness. Without medicine, without any knowledge of what caused decay, the women of the castle turned to what they believed could cleanse: wine spirits and their own bodies. It sounds absurd now, but in the absence of science, desperation was the truest kind of faith. The first remedy was alcohol, and it was used with an almost religious devotion. Strong wine, mead, or distilled spirits were poured directly onto the open flesh. The burn was immediate, sharp enough to make even the most composed, noble woman gasp. The liquid would hiss faintly as it met the wound, foaming at the edges before trickling down her arm or leg in streaks of red and brown. It felt like purification, and in some small way it was. The sting was proof that something was working, that the pain had a meaning. Servants would stand nearby with cloths, blotting the blood and the liquor together, watching as the pale skin flushed dark and raw beneath their touch. But wine was expensive, and not everyone could spare it for injuries. When the bottles ran empty, or when an infection spread faster than supplies could be fetched, another remedy was whispered among the desperate: urine. Warm, immediate, and always available. To them, it was just practical. The body's own water, recycled as medicine. When a wound festered, the liquid was collected in small bowls, sometimes mixed with ash or vinegar, then poured slowly over the damaged skin. The smell would fill the air, sharp and unmistakable. The women would turn their heads away, their eyes fixed on the wall as they endured it. The warmth offered a brief illusion of comfort before the burning began all over again. There was no embarrassment in the act. Within the castle walls, necessity simply erased shame. The same women who covered their faces in blood for beauty now cleaned their wounds with waste for survival. The two acts were not so different. Both were born from the same belief that what came from the body could also heal it. The servants followed the orders without question, holding the bowls steady, wringing out cloths and wiping the edges of the wound. They had done it too many times to be disturbed. It was only another part of their daily life, another scent joining the tapestry of the castle's air. Injuries were everywhere. A knife might slip during meal preparation, a splinter could pierce through a glove and skin, or a burn might flare up from tending the hearth. They were small things, but in winter, small things mattered. The cold slowed healing, and dirt clung to everything. Without soap or sterile tools, infection crept in quickly. At first came the heat, then a dull ache, then the thick, yellow swelling that marked the beginning of decay. The women treated each stage the same way, with liquid and with prayer. If a wound refused to close, they would cover it with a cloth soaked in spirits, tightening it until the pain throbbed in rhythm with their own heartbeat. The smell of these makeshift treatments lingered in every room. It mixed with the smoke, the wet wool, the breath of sleeping bodies. The sharpness of alcohol gave way to the sourness of urine, and together they hung in the air, faintly sweet, faintly rotten. Guests would notice it immediately, but they would say nothing. To live in a castle was to live inside a wound that never truly healed. Beautiful from afar, but foul up close. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like cleaning a cut with perfume one day and mop water the next, and being convinced that both could save you. The body adapted to the pain. The women learned to press the liquor to their skin without flinching, to breathe slowly through the sting, to thank the gods when the swelling finally went down. Those who survived enough infections began to call themselves lucky. A healed scar was a mark of endurance, not shame. They wore them beneath their gowns like invisible medals of their quiet suffering. No one spoke of the ones who did not heal, whose fevers grew, whose limbs turned black and stiff before the end. Death came softly in such cases, often mistaken for sleep, until the morning light revealed the truth. Some believed the smell of wine or urine kept away the spirits of illness. The scent of fermentation was cleansing, they said, a sign of purity rather than decay. They would sprinkle the liquids not just on wounds, but around their beds, on their doorways, and even on the tools they used for cutting. It was ritual more than reason, yet it gave them a sense of comfort. The world was full of dangers they could not see, and every small gesture of control mattered. There is something heartbreakingly logical in how they turned their own discomfort into medicine. When survival is the only goal, the line between a cure and cruelty simply disappears. They did what they could with what they had, and that was enough to keep most of them alive, if only barely. When the treatments were finished, the bowls were emptied into the fire or out the window. The smell would drift for hours afterward, seeping into the stone. The wounds would close, but never cleanly. The scars hardened, pink and uneven, reminders of the body's quiet endurance. And when the next cut appeared, as it always did, the ritual began again with the same calm resignation as before. The smell of survival clung to every hand, every fabric, every wall. And somewhere in the midst of that scent, another secret form of concealment was taking shape. Not to heal the body, but to hide its dirt. Long fingernails were once a quiet symbol of privilege, proof that a woman's hands did not labor like those of the servants. But in the chill of medieval castles, beauty and practicality rarely aligned. Nails grew unchecked through the months of cold, when knives were too dull and water was too scarce for trimming. They would curl and darken with grime, collecting soot, ash, and the faint shimmer of grease from meals eaten by hand. To disguise what could not be cleaned, women began wrapping their fingertips in wool. The soft strands of spun fiber hid the filth beneath a look of comfort and grace. It's a small irony that what appeared so delicate and refined was, in truth, just a covering for decay. The practice was spoken of as a kind of elegance, a fashion of quiet dignity. Nobles called it the winter sheath, as though it were a mark of care. But beneath the layers of colored, wool lay the black crescents of dirt and skin. Water was too cold to wash with, soap was too precious, and time was too short between prayers, meals, and duties. The fingertips, always exposed to the soot and smoke, bore the evidence of living. So they hid it. The wool was wound tightly, finger by finger, in rings that covered the nails completely. The colors varied. Deep brown for practicality, crimson for vanity, gray for mourning. Some wore them as a decoration, others as a protection from the sight of their own hands. The wool itself held warmth, but it also held moisture. As the days passed, it would darken and stiffen, gathering oils from the skin and dust from the air. The smell was faint but constant, a blend of sweat, wool grease, and the musty scent of the castle's smoky air. To mask it, the women would slip tiny sprigs of dried herbs between the layers. Lavender, rosemary, or thyme, if the household had them. When they raised their hands to their faces, the faint scent would escape, a brief illusion of cleanliness. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like wearing gloves, not to stay warm, but to hide the dirt that never washes away. Some believed the coverings were more than just fashion. The cold air chapped the skin, cracked the nails, and caused the fingertips to bleed. Wrapping them in wool prevented that pain and made daily tasks like writing, sewing, or even touching fabric less unbearable. Yet even these small comforts came at a price. The fibers trapped moisture, keeping the skin damp and raw beneath the layers. The nails would soften, splitting or curling as they grew. When the wrappings were finally removed, the skin underneath was pale, wrinkled, and sometimes streaked with mold-like spots. But this was better than exposure, better than the sight of blackened crescents under nails that no amount of scrubbing could ever whiten. Servants would imitate their mistresses, though their wrappings were rougher and made of leftover scraps of cloth or felt. They wore them not for style, but to protect their fingers from constant work. When they carried buckets of water or swept the stone floors, the fabric would quickly turn gray and stiff. At night, they would remove the wrappings, rubbing their sore fingers with animal fat or ashes. In the morning, they tied them back on again, the same damp pieces of wool used until they finally fell apart. For both the noble women and the servants, the result was the same: hands that were never truly clean. The castle's constant smoke made everything worse. Fine black dust from the hearth clung to every surface, especially to the fingers that touched wood, fabric, or food. It found its way beneath the wrappings, staining both the skin and the wool. The combination of sweat and soot created a dark sheen that no one tried to remove anymore. Cleanliness was measured not by purity, but by concealment. To hide the evidence of filth was the closest thing to being clean. On feast days, the women would replace the dull wool with brighter yarn, sometimes even embroidered with small beads or threads of silver. The wrappings became ornaments, small gestures of status that said, "I am untouched by work." But under the candlelight, the truth remained hidden. The faint smell of must, the soft decay of the fabric, and the blackened nails pressed beneath it all. It was beauty constructed over rot, just as much a symbol of survival as of vanity. There is something hauntingly human in how we wrap ugliness in decoration and call it dignity. When sleep came, some kept the wrappings on, afraid that the cold might stiffen their joints or that the smell of their own hands might wake them. The wool would rub against their faces as they turned in bed, leaving traces of dust on the pillows. By morning, the strands were tangled and frayed. But the habit continued. To uncover one's hands was to reveal what life inside the castle truly looked like. Unwashed, exhausted, and endlessly concealed. Occasionally, a woman would unwrap her fingers beside the fire, examining the damage beneath. The skin was soft and tender, the nails ridged and yellowed. She might rub them gently with a mixture of ash and oil, pretending that the gray smear was cleansing. Then she would wrap them again, tighter than before, sealing in the warmth and the shame alike. By spring, when the ice melted and washing was possible again, the wool wrappings were thrown away, stiff and dark from use. The hands beneath were raw, lined with cracks that told stories of both neglect and endurance. But for now, in the depth of winter, those small woolen bands were both a shield and a disguise. An answer to the question of how one might appear pure in a place where nothing ever truly was. The women of the castle learned to hide what could not be fixed, to wrap decay in softness, and to call it refinement. But not all concealment was harmless. Sometimes, what was hidden beneath the fabric grew into something worse, something that left stains even the thickest wool could not disguise. Clothing in the castle was not just a matter of appearance. It was armor against the relentless cold. The great stone walls never truly warmed, no matter how many fires burned. And so the women layered fabric upon fabric until they could barely move. The gowns changed with the seasons, heavier wool in winter, lighter linen in summer. But beneath those layers, one thing remained constant: the undergarments. These were the same garments worn day after day, week after week, through sweat, smoke, and sleep. Washing them was unthinkable in the cold, and removing them, even for a short time, felt like inviting sickness to crawl into the body. It's remarkable how easily necessity can disguise itself as habit until filth feels like safety. The underclothes were made of wool, sheepskin, or thick linen, meant to trap warmth close to the skin. At first, they served their purpose well. The material absorbed sweat, kept the body from freezing, and softened slightly with wear. But as the days passed, the fibers darkened with oil and dust. The smell of the body soaked into them, growing richer with each layer of fabric added on top. Women learned to live within their own scent, breathing it in as part of the air. Removing the undergarments, even for cleaning, was a risk few dared to take. The shock of cold air against bare skin was said to bring fever, or worse. So they simply endured. Each new gown was pulled over the same base, trapping old air beneath new fabric. The warmth it created was deceptive. It felt protective, but it also sealed in the moisture of sweat and the heaviness of dust. When a woman moved, The fabric brushed softly against itself, releasing faint waves of an odor that no one noticed anymore. In a room where every person smelled the same, the scent became invisible. Cleanliness was relative. Only visitors from elsewhere, clergy, merchants, or messengers, noticed the difference, wrinkling their noses before quickly learning to hide it. Laundry, when it was done, was reserved for outer garments. Servants would haul buckets of icy water from the courtyard and scrub wool skirts or cloaks against rough stones. The underclothes, however, rarely made that journey. They were too intimate, too troublesome to dry, and too essential to remove. A wet garment clung to the body like ice. It was better to keep the old one stiff and stale than to risk the chill that came with washing. Women sprinkled dried herbs, mint, thyme, or lavender, between their layers instead, pretending the scent meant cleanliness. The illusion was enough. The air between the fabrics grew warm and dense. Sweat dried where it formed, leaving faint lines of salt along the seams. The friction of movement polished the fabric until it shone in certain places. The body beneath it learned to adapt. Its skin roughened and reddened. Its pores sealed beneath the constant pressure. When infections appeared, rashes, sores, or boils, they were treated with powders or cloths soaked in spirits, never by removing the source. The garments were protection, even when they caused harm. Servants faced worse. Their clothing was rougher, made of coarse wool or patched scraps, and they had fewer to rotate. Many wore the same set all winter long, sleeping in it, working in it, living inside it like a second skin. When spring came, they would peel the garments away in pieces, the fabric stiff with grime and the seams dark with old sweat. Some burned them outright, throwing the rags into the fire with a sense of relief. Yet for months afterward, their skin carried the faint memory of what they had worn, the smell, the weight, the constriction. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like wearing the same thermal underwear for an entire season and convincing yourself it was clean because it kept you alive. For noble women, the layers became a mark of distinction. The more fabric one could afford, the higher one's status. They spoke of warmth as a luxury, of heaviness as grace. Their dresses swelled in volume, their corsets tightened, their sleeves thickened until their bodies were encased in fabric prisons they could barely escape. When the fires burned too hot, they would sweat in silence, trapped between modesty and suffocation. The scent of their bodies rose faintly through the perfume and powdered hair. Even the air of refinement carried the weight of human life beneath it. There is something both tender and tragic in how they learned to find comfort in discomfort, mistaking endurance for elegance. The castle taught its women that survival itself was a form of beauty, that to suffer gracefully was the truest mark of nobility. When night came, they loosened a few ties, unfastened the top layers, and lay down in the very same garments they had worn since morning. The sheets absorbed the same scent, the same warmth, the same residue of sweat. By morning, it was as though nothing had changed. The clothes held their shape, molded to the body that never left them. The layers trapped more than heat, they trapped time. Every fiber held a story of labor, stillness, and the endless rhythm of survival in the cold. And as they pressed their faces into the same collars and sleeves day after day, the castle seemed to breathe with them, heavy, warm, and faintly alive. Beneath those layers, something else began to fester, something they could not perfume away or hide. Even the smallest part of the body, when neglected for too long, found its own way of reminding them that cleanliness was never more than a dream. The floors of the castle were always cold, even beneath thick rugs or layers of straw. No amount of fire could ever warm the stone beneath a woman's feet. The chill crept upward from the ground, numbing her toes and stiffening her joints until walking became a pain disguised as grace. To fight this, the women turned to one of their few luxuries, wax. Beeswax, melted over a gentle flame and mixed with crushed herbs or perfume oil, became a kind of salve. They would spread it across the soles of their feet each morning, believing it would protect them from the cold and seal in warmth. It's almost touching that something meant to preserve beauty could so easily turn into a trap. The practice began among noble women and spread quickly. The wax was stored in small pots beside their combs and powders, its surface smooth and golden. A servant would warm it by the fire until it softened, then kneel to apply it with careful fingers. The scent would fill the room, sweet and floral if the family was wealthy enough to afford imported oils, but bitter and smoky if not. When spread thinly, the wax formed a barrier, locking moisture into the skin. It softened cracks, eased pain, and gave the illusion of care. The women believed it made their steps quieter and their movements more graceful. But the wax also made their feet slick, and when pressed into the smooth lining of their leather shoes, it turned them into hidden hazards. The floors of the castle were uneven, worn by time and footsteps. Wooden planks creaked, stone corridors sweated with condensation, and rugs slid easily underfoot. A thin film of wax between leather and skin turned walking into a delicate balance between elegance and accident. Many women slipped, sometimes only a few inches, sometimes hard enough to bruise their knees or twist an ankle. The sound of a fall would echo down the long hallways, followed by the rustle of skirts and the murmured reassurance of servants. No one ever admitted that the cause was vanity. Falling, after all, was unseemly, but the ritual of the wax was fashionable. It could not be abandoned. The mixture itself varied. The wealthy preferred beeswax blended with rose oil or crushed lavender, the scent rising with every step they took. Others used simple animal fat, stiffened with ash and candle drippings. Over time, the wax would darken with use, gathering dust and fabric fibers until the sheen faded. Still, they reapplied it daily. The soft glow on their feet became a mark of refinement, proof that even the parts of the body hidden from sight were cared for. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like polishing your shoes from the inside out and then slipping because you tried too hard to be perfect. Servants imitated the habit with whatever they could find. Candle wax scraped from the walls of the chapel, mixed with leftover herbs, served as their version. The scent was harsher and the feel was stickier, but they too sought relief from the biting cold. Their shoes were rough and full of holes, and the wax filled the gaps, sealing out the pain for a few hours at least. At the end of the day, it would harden into a thin crust that cracked when they flexed their feet. The poor wiped it off with rags. The rich reapplied perfume and called it a treatment. As the days passed, the wax built up, layer upon layer. It trapped not only warmth, but also the smell of sweat. The combination of beeswax and flesh created a heavy sweetness that clung to the air, faintly sour beneath the perfume. When shoes were removed at night, the scent would spread through the room, mingling with the smoke and the damp wool. Some ignored it, while others burned herbs near their beds to mask it. But in the small, enclosed chambers of the castle, nothing ever truly disappeared. The air itself seemed to remember every scent, every indulgence. The practice also left traces behind. Wax smudges on rugs, footprints on the stone floor that shone faintly in the candlelight, small yellow flakes where the salve had peeled away. These marks were swept aside by servants who grumbled quietly, while scraping wax from leather soles and fabric hems. The same material used for candles to light the halls was now cluttering the floors in the name of comfort. Beauty had a way of multiplying its own mess. Despite the risks, the women could not abandon the habit. They spoke of the wax's healing touch, of how it softened the skin and made walking more graceful. And in truth, the warmth it trapped must have felt heavenly in those frozen mornings. The first step after application was always a shock. The cold floor met by the smooth, waxed foot, a momentary glide between pleasure and danger. It was a luxury that reminded them they were not like the peasants trudging barefoot in the mud. Even if they fell, they felt surrounded by silk, perfume, and candlelight. There is something almost poetic in the idea of slipping on one's own comfort, as if the body refused to let pride walk unhumbled. When night came, the wax remained. Some wiped it off with scraps of linen, while others simply left it, letting it harden while they slept. The sheets beneath their feet grew slick with residue. In the morning, the ritual began again, melting, mixing, spreading, believing. The wax shone faintly in the dawn light, as though reflecting their quiet endurance. The same heat that softened the wax also softened their resistance to habit. And just as the wax sealed the skin, the layers of routine sealed their lives, trapping them in the comfort of repetition. Eyebrows in the world of the medieval castle were more than just decoration. They were protection. The cold wind that slipped through cracks in the stone stung the skin and numbed the face, so every hair became valuable, every bit of warmth precious. Thick eyebrows were not only considered beautiful, but also practical, helping to trap heat around the eyes and forehead. To keep them soft and shaped, the women would brush them daily with wooden sticks dipped in animal fat. The routine was quiet, almost ceremonial, performed beside small mirrors and flickering candles. It's oddly comforting to imagine an elegance born not from vanity, but from the simple need to stay warm. The choice of fat varied with status and availability. Goose or chicken grease was common among noble households, while horse oil, saved from the stables, was favored for its thicker texture. The fat was melted gently near the hearth, stirred until it was smooth, and then left to cool into a pale, glossy balm. A small stick, carved from wood, served as both a brush and a tool. Women would dip it into the pot, coating it lightly, then run it through their brows with slow, practiced strokes. The result was a shine that caught the firelight and a faint layer of warmth across the skin. What looked like grooming was, in truth, survival. Over time, the fat absorbed the smoke and smells of the castle, the faint sweetness of burning wood, the bitterness of cooked meat, the earthy tang of wool. To disguise this, women began mixing herbs and spices into the balm. A pinch of ground cinnamon, dried rose petals, or crushed mint added both scent and color. When brushed on, the mixture released a faint fragrance that lingered near the face. From a distance, it gave the illusion of cleanliness. Up close, it was merely warmth hiding behind perfume. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like using cooking grease as a beauty product and calling it skincare. The texture of the grease made the eyebrows look darker and fuller, a feature that soon became fashionable. Women would admire one another's brows by candlelight, the sheen of oil mistaken for vitality. They believed that well-fed eyebrows brought health to the face, keeping the forehead supple and the skin from cracking in the cold. Some even rubbed the remaining fat over their temples or down the sides of their noses, convinced it could guard against frostbite. The logic was simple. What softened the meat in the kitchen must also soften the flesh. Servants who could not afford to waste food fat copied the practice in smaller ways. They used the leftover oil skimmed from cooking pots, which was often rancid, and brushed it on with bits of straw or cloth. The smell was harsher, but the effect was the same. In a castle where beauty was tied to warmth and status, even imitation became a form of survival. By evening, the thin layer of oil would have trapped dust and ash, turning glossy brows into dull streaks of brown. Still, they were brushed again the next morning, as if repetition could preserve the illusion of refinement. The act itself became strangely intimate. Sitting by the hearth, women would lean close to the mirror, breathing in the scent of warm fat and smoke. The wooden stick moved slowly, almost tenderly, tracing the same small arcs each day. The fire reflected in their eyes, their movements calm and deliberate. The ritual grounded them, a small act of control in a life that offered so little. Beauty, warmth, and discipline all merged into one single gesture. There were, of course, accidents. A servant, distracted by conversation, might let the fat overheat, causing it to splatter and burn. The smell of singed oil would fill the chamber, clinging to clothes and hair. Yet even this did not end the practice. No matter how crude the ingredients or how strange the process, it gave the illusion of grace. A woman with polished brows looked cared for, her composure intact even in discomfort. And in a world ruled by appearances, that mattered more than anything. There is something gently tragic in how these small rituals, meant to preserve warmth, became the very proof of refinement. The same grease that dripped from roasting meat was transformed by habit and hope into an emblem of elegance. It was a way of telling themselves that life inside those cold walls could still be beautiful, even when beauty smelled faintly of smoke. As night fell, the fires dimmed and the air cooled once more. The fat on their brows stiffened, trapping the faint scent of spice beneath a layer of soot. When they lay down to sleep, the oil smeared onto their pillows, marking the linen like a faint signature of the day's survival. The warmth of the face was safe for now, but another kind of ritual waited nearby, one less graceful, less fragrant, and far harder to ignore, for it began with something as ordinary as a cough. The sound of the fire was never the only thing that filled the great rooms of the castle. In the pauses between the crackle of wood and the soft hiss of smoke, there were other, smaller sounds. The clearing of throats, the sharp wetness of spitting, the faint thud of liquid hitting stone. It was as ordinary as breathing. Without clean water, without the means to wash or gargle, people relied on the warmth of their own mouths to clear the bitterness that built up overnight. Each morning, women would lean toward the hearth and spit into the flames, watching the saliva vanish with a soft sizzle. It's both strange and understandable that what began as disgust soon turned into a routine, just another way of surviving the cold. The air in the castle was thick and smoky, heavy with soot that coated their tongues and throats. Hours spent near open fires filled their mouths with dust, leaving them dry and sour. There were no rinses, no brushes, no cups of clean water waiting on bedside tables. Instead, they used what the body gave them: a cough, a spit, a momentary relief. The hearth was always nearby, always burning, and its heat seemed to swallow everything. The logic was simple: the fire could cleanse anything. If it could burn meat down to the bone, surely it could purify the foulness of the body. By midday, the stone around the hearth would glisten faintly from use. Servants swept the ashes each morning, but the practice never stopped. The very same flames that roasted their food and warmed their hands became the household's invisible basin. Men and women alike would lean close, clearing their throats, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. The air would hiss quietly as moisture met heat. No one found it pleasant, but everyone accepted it. In a world where filth was constant, it was the illusion of cleansing that mattered most. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like spitting into a radiator and calling it hygiene. The smell of burnt saliva was faint, masked by the smoke and the scent of charred wood. But sometimes, when the fire burned low and the draft shifted, it would carry a sour undertone through the room. The women noticed it, but they said nothing. They had grown used to worse. The castle was already filled with stronger odors: wax, wool, sweat, meat, and decay. One more layer made no difference. The fireplace stood as both a comfort and a confession, the place where warmth met waste, where small shames disappeared in the same flames that gave life. Coughing was constant. The cold air irritated throats already raw from the smoke. Dust rose from the straw beds, from the rugs, from the very air they breathed. The body's response was endless clearing, endless spitting. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, the sound would echo across the chambers, mingling with the crackle of burning wood. It was almost rhythmic, the pulse of survival in a place that offered so little ease. To them, it was simply how life sounded, alive, imperfect, human. Not all the spitting was for cleanliness. Some believed it warded off illness. Warm saliva was thought to draw out a fever, to release bad humors that were trapped within the body. A quick spit into the flames after coughing was a kind of charm against sickness, a gesture that was half medical, half spiritual. Others claimed it pleased the fire itself, feeding it something of the body in exchange for heat. These small beliefs kept the ritual alive long after reason might have abandoned it. The line between superstition and necessity blurred easily in the flickering light. The servants were the ones who tended the fires, and they saw everything. They would wipe the stone edges, add new logs, and watch the cycle repeat. Sometimes they too would lean forward and spit quietly, less from belief than from sheer exhaustion. They were closer to the filth of daily life than anyone, their hands blackened by soot, their mouths filled with the same dry taste. The hearth united them all, lady, servant, child, and cook, in a shared act of unspeakable intimacy. To spit into the same fire was to share the same air, the same surrender to survival. There is something darkly poetic about how the fire, a symbol of purity and warmth, became the very thing that consumed their waste. It burned endlessly, swallowing every trace of discomfort while leaving behind its own kind of dirt. The ash that settled on their skin, in their lungs, on every surface of the castle. When the embers dimmed at night, the faint traces of the day's offerings remained. A thin, white crust of dried spittle mixed with soot at the base of the hearth, invisible in the dark, but waiting to crackle when the morning fires were lit again. And so the cycle continued: spit, burn, forget. Cleanliness was an illusion that flickered as briefly as the flame itself. The fire might have hidden what they expelled, but nothing in the castle ever stayed truly gone. Even as they leaned over the hearth each morning, the same warmth they trusted was also feeding another kind of decay, one that clung to their clothes, their beds, and even the snow that waited just outside. The snow outside the castle was the purest thing most people had ever seen. It covered the filth of the world in a blanket of silence, turning mud into white stillness and decay into something almost beautiful. When water was scarce and the wells froze solid, that same snow became the only means of washing. Women would step out into the courtyard wrapped in thick cloaks, the cold biting through every layer, and gather handfuls of it as though they were collecting pearls. They pressed it against their skin, feeling the sting that came before the numbness. The first touch was always sharp, like fire that had been turned to ice. And yet they continued, believing that the pain meant it was cleansing them. It's remarkable how the absence of comfort can make suffering feel like purity. Inside their chambers, The air was stale and heavy with smoke. The water they kept in barrels had frozen days ago, and breaking it apart required tools and strength that most of the women did not have. Snow, by contrast, was everywhere. It was clean, soft, and free. Servants would carry it inside in wooden buckets, their hands red raw from the cold, and spread it into basins. When the women began to rub it over their arms and faces, the snow melted instantly on contact, dripping down their skin in thin, trembling lines. The shock of it made them gasp, but the feeling that followed, a momentary coolness, a sense of renewal, was enough to make them endure it again. The ritual had its order. They would start with the face, wiping away the layer of soot and sweat that had gathered overnight. Their cheeks would flush bright red under the cold, a look that many mistook for health. Then came the neck and shoulders, where the skin was pale and tender. The snow would cling to the fine hairs and melt into drops that rolled down their backs, seeping into the fabric of their undergarments. The discomfort was immediate. Yet there was no better choice. To stay dirty was shameful. To feel clean, even for a moment, was worth the pain. If you think about it now, it would be like scrubbing your skin with ice cubes and calling it a bath. The poorest women often had no privacy. They would wash behind half-closed doors or thin curtains, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Some would rub their hands and feet until they bled. The cold made the skin crack open, but stopping was not an option. Dirt in their minds was disease. The snow, though merciless, was at least a promise of purity. A few even believed it carried some divine power, that its whiteness reflected the grace of heaven itself. The irony, of course, was that this same purity was burning them raw. Noble women fared little better. Their chambers might have held small braziers or covered fires, but warm water was still a luxury. Snow washing became a mark of endurance, almost a virtue. They prided themselves on tolerating the cold with grace, their maids attending quietly, refilling basins with new snow as the old melted into a cloudy slush. The scene was one of quiet suffering, white flakes melting against flushed skin, the faint hiss of ice meeting warmth, and the steady rhythm of breath that fogged the air. The women said little. Pain had long been folded into the fabric of their lives. The snow left behind more than just clean skin. It stripped away the natural oils that protected the body, leaving it dry and fragile. After washing, women would rub themselves with animal fat or wax to restore what the ice had taken away. The result was an odd mixture of sensations, burning cold followed by a sticky warmth. Numbness mingled with relief. The body never truly settled. It only adapted. To survive a winter in the castle meant accepting discomfort as a constant. Every act of cleanliness was also an act of harm. Children were not spared these routines. Mothers would wipe their faces with handfuls of snow, scolding them for crying. The redness that followed was taken as a sign of vitality. The stronger the flush, the healthier the child was thought to be. There were no mirrors for reflection, No second thoughts about a cruelty that was disguised as care. Pain was not only accepted, it was proof that one had done something right. The lesson was learned young and was never forgotten. Servants often reused the melted snow as washing water for garments or tools. It carried traces of skin, soot, and sometimes blood, but waste was unthinkable. The same water might be used again to scrub the floors or to wash dishes. The distinction between clean and unclean blurred with each reuse, and no one questioned it. The world outside the castle was far worse, they reasoned, and compared to the filth of the streets, a little melted snow seemed almost luxurious. By evening, the women's skin would glow from the repeated friction. Beneath the pale candlelight, the redness looked almost radiant, giving the illusion of warmth in rooms that were anything but. Some took pride in the look, calling it the winter bloom, as if it were a beauty achieved by choice rather than necessity. Yet beneath the surface, their skin throbbed with small wounds invisible to the eye. Infection was common, but silence was safer than complaint. The castle air carried too many secrets already. It's both pitiful and fascinating how people can convince themselves that pain equals purity. They turned a simple handful of snow into a ritual of cleansing, a daily battle against the dirt and decay that the world had already accepted as inevitable. Cleanliness became a dream they could touch, even if only for the few seconds before the ice melted away. The cold of the castle did not end with the washing. It seeped into every fabric, every breath, every sound. Even the beds that promised rest were touched by the frost, their sheets stiff and cool against bare skin. The snow outside might have offered a brief moment of purity, but inside, another chill was waiting, one that crept up from the floor and settled into the bones, even as they tried to sleep. The day's cleansing might have been over, but the night would bring its own kind of struggle, as warmth itself became a luxury that only memory could hold. The scent of herbs was one of the few pleasant things left in a cold stone castle. It would drift faintly from under sleeves and collars, from the folds of wool and linen, where bodies hid their own decay. Under each arm, tucked close against the skin, many women carried small pillows filled with dried grass, lavender, mint, or whatever fragrant weeds the season allowed. They called them scent cushions, but their true purpose was much simpler. In a world where bathing was rare, these little bundles stood between a person and the unbearable truth of their own smell. It's oddly tender and slightly absurd that comfort could come from a rotting bundle of hay pressed into one's armpit. The cushions were made by hand, stitched with coarse thread, and filled with whatever herbs had been gathered before the frost came. Some were wrapped in cloth that had been perfumed with vinegar or wine, which was thought to keep sickness away. The women would press them carefully under their arms before dressing, layering their bodices and sleeves over them until they were completely invisible. The warmth of the body would release the herbs sent slowly throughout the day. At first, it masked the odor of sweat and the animal fat they used on their skin. But as the hours passed, the herbs would begin to break down. their fragrance mingling with the very smells they were trying to hide. The resulting mixture was sharp, earthy, and unmistakably human. The wealthy had their cushions stuffed with lavender, rosemary, or thyme, herbs that were imported or traded at great cost. Poorer women used hay, straw, or even dried moss that they collected from the walls of wells. Each material carried its own scent, its own decay. Some mixtures produced an aroma that clung to the air, light and floral. Others smelled like damp cellars, like dust and wilted leaves. Still, everyone believed in their usefulness. To smell of herbs, no matter how faintly, was to appear civilized. If you were to compare it to the present day, it would be like walking around with a scented dryer sheet under each arm and calling it hygiene. Changing the pillows was considered a part of one's grooming, though it happened rarely. Once a week, perhaps, if the scent faded or the fabric darkened, the cushion would be replaced. The old ones were left near the hearth to dry or were hung on pegs to air out, but their usefulness quickly diminished. In the damp chill of the castle, even the finest herbs could not last long. Mold would creep in easily, and once it did, the pillows would give off a heavy smell of earth and moisture. Yet the women preferred that to the sour odor of unwashed skin. Decay, in their eyes, was more bearable when it smelled of flowers. The habit spread far beyond the noble chambers. Servants and cooks used smaller versions, rags stuffed with straw or crushed mint. These were cheaper, easy to replace, and often shared among the household staff. In the kitchens, where the smell of smoke and grease was constant, such cushions offered a small relief. Even when their scent turned stale, they carried the illusion of cleanliness. And that illusion was enough. The world outside was foul, but at least one could control the odor beneath one's own arm. Some believed that certain herbs held healing powers. Mint was said to calm the heart, lavender to steady the nerves, and rosemary to purify the blood. The women would speak of these things quietly as they prepared their little bundles, as though each pillow was a private charm. It wasn't just about the scent, it was about hope. The belief that something small and fragrant could protect them from rot and disease. Whether they believed in medicine or magic hardly mattered. The herbs gave them something to do, a ritual in a life that was otherwise dictated by cold and necessity. When the day's work was over, the cushions were often left in place. To remove them would mean exposing the body to the air, to the chill that waited just beyond the warmth of their clothing. So the scent of herbs filled their sleep as well, mingling with the smell of smoke from the fire and wool from their bedding. In the dark, the fragrances became softer, dreamlike, almost pleasant. The same pillow that covered the body's shame by day turned into a strange comfort at night, a reminder that they had done what they could to remain decent in a world that offered so little decency. But time betrayed even these small comforts. The herbs eventually crumbled into dust, leaving behind faint stains on the fabric. The cloth yellowed from sweat, and the threads loosened. Some women tried to refresh the scent by sprinkling wine or vinegar on the cushions, but that only hastened their decay. Others ignored the change altogether, growing accustomed to the damp, musty odor. It blended with the smell of their garments, their rooms, their very breath. To them, that was simply the smell of life. It's quietly tragic how human beings can adapt to filth when the choice is between a stench and the cold. The women of the castle pressed their little cushions close, pretending they were clean, pretending that the smell of lavender meant purity instead of just exhaustion. It was a lie they carried willingly, and one that comforted them far more than the truth ever could. When morning came, the same cushions were lifted from under one arm to the other. Day after day, week after week, they absorbed sweat, smoke, and silence, becoming a part of the body they were meant to disguise. By the time they were replaced, the new ones were already doomed to the same fate. The cycle was endless: mask, decay, replace, repeat. The snow outside might have covered the earth in white, but inside the castle, cleanliness remained nothing more than a fragrance borrowed from the dead leaves of summer. And so, beneath the weight of their gowns and the stillness of the winter air, the women of the castle smelled faintly of herbs and dust, a sweetness that was meant to hide the rot that lay beneath. The cold made even simple things cruel. In the heart of winter, the bars of soap that had once been soft and fragrant turned into brittle stones. Left near a window or on a cold shelf, they would crack open like frozen bread, their surfaces hard and useless. The women would find themselves staring at these shattered pieces, knowing there was no way to coax them back to life. The luxury of foam, the light feeling of water washing away dirt, that was gone until spring returned. In its place, they turned to what could not freeze: ashes and alcohol. It sounds almost comedic now. That cleanliness depended on a bucket of soot and a cup of wine. But in those winters, that was the height of hygiene. The hearth became their apothecary. When the fires burned down to embers, the ashes were gathered into bowls and mixed with whatever liquid remained unfrozen. Rubbing alcohol was rare, but wine or strong spirits were easier to find. A few drops of these over the ashes would turn the mixture into a gray paste that smelled of smoke and sour grapes. This was their soap. It stung the skin, left stains on their fingers, and offered no comfort. Yet they used it with a quiet determination. The goal was not beauty or scent, it was survival. The attempt to keep disease from finding a home in the body. The first touch of the mixture on the skin was sharp and cold. It burned the small wounds left by work or frostbite. The ash would cling to every crease of the hand, turning their palms gray, their nails blackened. But after wiping it away with a damp cloth, the woman would feel a strange relief. The grit scraped away the oil, the smell, the sense of decay. The illusion of cleanliness was enough to lift the spirit, just for a moment. Even pain, in that world, became a sign that something was working. If we think about it now, it would be like scrubbing yourself with fireplace dust and vodka, and then convincing yourself you were sanitized. The richer households had access to fine ashes from clean wood, sifted and soft, almost like powder. Poorer families used whatever they could find: coal dust, burnt straw, or char from the cooking fires. The color of their cleaning paste told the story of their status: pale gray for the wealthy, nearly black for the poor. Some added herbs to disguise the odor, though the effect never lasted long. Once the paste met the skin, all scents just blended into one: smoke, wine, and the unmistakable tang of sweat. The castle itself seemed to breathe it, as if the walls had absorbed the residue of every attempt at being clean. There was no lather, no shining surface, no soft towel to finish the act. The cleaning ended with a cold rinse, or sometimes with nothing at all. Water was precious, and even when they had it, it was like ice. Most women just wiped themselves with a coarse linen, smearing the ash mixture until only streaks remained. The result was dry, irritated skin that flaked like parchment. Yet, compared to the filth of not washing at all, it felt like a victory. Cleanliness had never been a matter of comfort. It was a matter of dignity. Ash carried another kind of danger. When it was mixed with alcohol, it could react with the skin, leaving small burns or itching rashes. The women accepted these as ordinary. To them, a bit of pain was proof that the treatment was strong. Some even claimed the mixture tightened the skin or removed blemishes. The belief persisted because there was simply no better alternative. They lived in a time when what burned was believed to heal. Every sting was a promise that the dirt was dying. Servants were often responsible for preparing the paste. Their hands were raw from constantly handling it. The fine particles of ash would get under their nails and linger for days. They worked by the light of the hearth, stirring slowly, waiting for the alcohol to soak through. The smell filled the air, sweet and sour, smoky and bitter, and it clung to their hair, their sleeves, their breath. No matter how much they scrubbed, the scent stayed with them. It was the smell of cleanliness in a place that rarely knew what clean even meant. Women sometimes stored small jars of the mixture beside their beds. In the morning, before dressing, they would dip a rag into it and wipe their faces and necks. The skin would turn red from the friction, and the cold air would sting immediately afterward. They felt alive again, in a way that only pain in winter could make one feel alive. The thought of washing with warm water was a fantasy, something remembered from childhood summers. The castle walls held no warmth deep enough to melt ice, and so the body adapted to suffering as though it were just another season. Over time, the mixture would grow darker, thicker. The ash would mix with the oils from their hands, forming a kind of grime that was indistinguishable from what it was meant to remove. But they did not see the irony. The act of cleaning mattered more than the result. To be seen washing, to smell faintly of wine instead of rot, to feel a moment of ritual in the endless monotony of the cold. That was enough. The line between filth and purity blurred until it disappeared entirely. It's both grotesque and strangely beautiful how people can create a ritual out of ruin, turning the debris of a fire into a symbol of purity. In those cold months, the ashes of the hearth became the closest thing to salvation. Every grain carried a whisper of warmth long extinguished, a memory of the fire that once gave comfort. When the nights grew longest, the women still gathered near the hearth, rubbing their gray mixture between their frozen fingers, believing that if they just kept up the habit, they would remain untouched by sickness. Outside, the world lay silent under the snow. Inside, they smelled of smoke, wine, and endurance, the scent of life refusing to fade beneath the weight of winter. The nights inside the castle were long and cruel, and the cold outside was something no one dared to challenge. Beyond the stone walls, the latrine pits and wooden seats had turned into slabs of ice, their openings sealed by frost. The wind that cut through the corridors sounded like a warning. No one, not even the bravest servant, wanted to step into that frozen darkness once the fires had burned low. So the women of the castle learned to endure, lying awake under heavy blankets, holding themselves still, their bodies tensed against the pull of nature. It's oddly humbling to think that even nobles, wrapped in velvet and fur, fought the same nightly battle against their own bladders. The latrines were built at the edges of the castle, far from the main chambers, where drafts would slip through the cracks in the stone. During the summer, the air there was foul but bearable. In winter, it was unbearable in an entirely new way. The walls of those small, enclosed rooms dripped with condensation. The wooden seats, smooth from use, would freeze solid. Some even broke when sat upon, the moisture within the grain expanding in the cold. The floor was coated in a layer of frost that shimmered faintly under lantern light. Every breath turned to a mist that hung in the air, then settled as crystals along the edges of the pit. What was once merely unpleasant had become a trap of cold and danger. For the women who lived in the upper chambers, the journey to those frozen rooms was impossible. They would have to cross dark corridors, down staircases that were slick with ice, passing open archways where the wind howled through. Even with a candle, it was easy to slip, to fall, to lose one's light. And so they stayed where it was warmest, or rather, least cold, and hoped their bodies would obey them until dawn. Some whispered prayers to keep their sleep from deepening too much, for fear they would dream themselves into relief and wake to shame. The fear of the cold was stronger than the call of nature. Servants knew the struggle well. Their quarters were closer to the outer walls, colder and darker. Yet even they preferred endurance over venturing out. In those rooms, people would shift under their blankets, twisting quietly, pretending they were asleep. Sometimes the silence was broken by a creak of the floorboards, followed by the sound of someone lifting the lid of a chamber pot or pouring something faintly into a bucket. The smell was sharp, immediate, then quickly forgotten under the weight of the season. Shame, like the cold, lost its meaning when survival was the only rule. The rich had other solutions. A chamber pot placed under the bed or beside the fire became a necessity. The warmth of the flames kept the contents from freezing, though the smell would spread quickly through the room. Servants would empty them in the morning, their hands numb from holding the metal handles that still radiated the night's chill. In the most luxurious chambers, someone would stand ready with a bucket, summoned when needed, a task so humiliating it was rarely spoken of afterward. It's strange how easily class and dignity disappeared when nature reminded everyone of its rules. The architecture of the castle did little to help. Waste channels that were built into the outer walls would freeze solid, cracking from the pressure of the expanding ice. Sometimes the ice would push backward, forcing the filth back into the corridors. The air in those parts of the castle would become heavy with a mixture of smoke, mold, and something far worse. Fires and perfumes could only disguise so much. Winter turned everything inward, the heat, the breath, the odor, and the discomfort, until even the grandest hall felt smaller, closer, almost suffocating. Some tried tricks to ease the struggle. They would eat less at night, drink sparingly, or warm their stomachs with wine before bed. A few used small clay pots filled with warm stones, pressing them against their bellies to numb the need. But nothing truly worked. The body obeyed no season, and so they endured the pressure, the pain, the restless turning under layers of fur and wool. The night stretched on endlessly, each hour heavier than the last. In the faint light of dawn, when the fires were rekindled and the frost on the windows began to melt, the rush to the latrines was quiet but urgent. Cloaks were pulled over nightgowns, and the women would hurry through the corridors, their faces pale, their steps quick but careful. The first breath of the outside air felt like knives, and the relief that followed came mixed with shivering. The wooden seats, still cold to the touch, burned against their skin. Some would laugh weakly at the absurdity of it all, their breath turning white as it left their mouths. For the servants tasked with maintaining those icy latrines, the work never ended. They would break the ice each morning with hammers or pour boiling water from the kitchen to keep the pits usable. Steam would rise into the air for a few brief minutes before the cold conquered it again. The smell that followed was unbearable, yet necessary. Cleanliness in winter was an illusion. Even filth needed maintenance. The women of the castle accepted it as a part of life. No one questioned the absurdity of living surrounded by luxury, yet being unable to relieve oneself without fear. They had learned to accept discomfort as nobility and endurance as grace. What mattered was composure, the quiet smile at breakfast, the pretense that the night had been peaceful. Beneath the silks and the jewels, every woman carried the memory of her long vigil against the cold. It's both tragic and darkly humorous that survival in such grandeur depended on how long one could hold still. The castles of winter taught a humility that no sermon ever could, reminding even queens that nature made no exceptions. When darkness returned and the frost thickened on the windows once again, the same silent battle began anew. The torches flickered, the wind moaned through the cracks, and behind closed doors, every heartbeat was joined by the quiet ache of waiting. Inside the thick walls of the castle, winter had a way of dulling every sense. The smell of smoke, the damp air, the odor of bodies pressed together. All of it merged into something familiar. It was no longer filth. It was no longer even noticed. People breathed it in as naturally as they breathed the cold. Every person carried their own scent, and yet none of them believed it was strange. In that world, to stink was not to fail. It was simply to exist. There is something both horrifying and comforting in the idea that, surrounded by decay, no one could tell who was clean and who was not. Cleanliness, for those who lived in those stone halls, was a relative dream. The word itself meant something else entirely. It did not mean the absence of dirt, but the absence of difference. If everyone smelled of smoke and sweat and wool, then no one was dirty. The women of the castle would powder their faces, rub ash into their hands, and perfume their pillows not to cleanse, but to blend in. Their goal was not purity, only sameness. It was easier to belong in the stink than it was to stand apart from it. The mind adapts faster than the body. After weeks without washing, after nights spent beside chamber pots and hearths filled with soot, the senses simply stopped protesting. The nose learned to forgive. The air became invisible again, and life returned to its rhythm. To eat, to pray, to endure the cold. These things mattered more than any imagined notion of freshness. Dirt was not shameful. It was the proof of survival. Even the grandest, noble woman carried the scent of her surroundings. Her perfume could not hide the smoke that clung to her sleeves or the faint trace of mold in her furs. The servants who brushed her hair would catch the same odor on their own skin. And so the hierarchy would blur for a moment. Rich or poor, highborn or common, everyone breathed the same air and everyone smelled of the same truth. It's oddly democratic how filth leveled the classes more effectively than any law or rebellion could. There were no mirrors sharp enough to reflect such a reality, no clean air to remind them of what they had lost. The castle's great halls were filled with the echoes of laughter and prayer and scraping spoons. Beneath it all lay the quiet understanding that this was life as it had always been. When the scent of others matched your own, it was no longer unpleasant. It was a reassurance. You were not alone in your decay. You were part of a body larger than yourself, a collective scent of survival wrapped in wool and silence. At night, as the fires dimmed and the air grew heavier, that sameness became its own kind of comfort. The warmth of others, the faint musk of unwashed cloth, the hum of breathing in the dark. It all became a lullaby. They would close their eyes without flinching at the odor that surrounded them. Their exhaustion, which was deeper than their vanity, erased every awareness of smell or shame. The castle exhaled with them, steeped in the same ancient rhythm of acceptance. It was not clean, but it was human. No one thought of themselves as dirty. They simply existed in a balance with their world, and that balance brought a kind of peace. The walls that trapped the heat also trapped every breath, every faint sigh, every scent of life. But inside that confinement, there was a strange serenity. Filth was not their burden. It was their warmth. What mattered was endurance, not purity. What mattered was waking to another morning with the snow still outside and the body still alive inside. In the eyes of history, their world seems unthinkable. But for them, it was ordinary, even gentle. They did not know the contrast that we know. They did not have the smell of soap, the feel of hot water, or the crispness of clean sheets to compare against their reality. Ignorance in its quiet way was a mercy. The same air that would make us recoil was the air that lulled them into sleep. It's strange to think that peace could exist in such filth. Yet perhaps that is what allowed them to survive, winter after winter. When the night deepened and the wind pressed against the shutters, the castle settled into stillness. The fire burned low, and the rooms grew warm with the breath of those inside. Their bodies, unwashed and heavy with fatigue, sank into rest. The air was thick, but no one minded. To them it was safety. It was the smell of another day survived. No one felt unclean, because no one remembered what clean was supposed to be. They drifted into dreams under layers of wool and familiarity, their world small, warm, and complete. And so the castle slept as it had for centuries, wrapped in its own scent of history. The same walls that held their secrets also held their comfort, their weakness, their humanity. In that darkness, filth and peace became one and the same. Thank you for walking through the cold and the dust of their world tonight. May your own bed feel softer, your air cleaner, and your rest deeper. Good night and sleep well.